Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Hello Gamer Nation and welcome to the Dice Pool Podcast, covering everything that you've ever wanted to know about how to run and play in the Genesis role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games. I'm your host, GM Hooly, and this episode we have an interesting and often not discussed topic to cover. But before we dive into that, let me introduce you to my co-hosts who are so strong of will that their rickrolled introduction of them on our last episode was allowed to go completely unpunished, perhaps until now anyway. GM Huzz, GM Flano and GM Kaitlin. How are we all this evening?
I'm doing well.
I'm doing pretty good.
Yes, doing well. And as always, never going to give you up, never going to let you down.
Indeed.
That's why we're here. That's why we're here.
Yes. Now, because one mic is never enough to have on the show, we have a special guest tonight. And that would be our friend of the podcast, Michael Molyneux, the man who's bringing the entire topic of today's show to us and our listeners.
Yeah, we're basically just sitting here today, and he's going to talk.
Pretty much.
It's going to be great.
So
It's a day off.
It's going to be one of the best episodes we've had, probably.
The listeners are like, finally, they're shutting up.
That's right.
They're not so lucky.
So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Very
I
good.
have to say, I do like your name.
Me too.
Yeah, so how are we going to do that? The Michael and Mike. So you're definitely going to be Huzz and you're going to be Michael, I think.
Yes, or Mick.
Or Mick. Okay, we can go there. That's fine.
We can be Mike and Mick.
Right, cool. That's, now I'm really confused.
Well, now we've got, We've got 4 mics in here.
No, we've
One
got six. 6 mics.
This is very confusing.
Wow. And we've got a mic in another country, apparently, as well.
7 mics.
Shit. We get around.
That's what she said. But
Could have been he.
so what's been going on in the gaming world for everyone, Mike? Or Huzz? Or whatever you want to call yourself?
Well, for me, what have I been doing? Been doing a lot of roleplay, including Legends of the Five Rings, which has been fun. Last night we did some Star Wars. We played some high-octane, action-packed one-shot adventure that took the players through an old Jedi temple where they had to confront a dying Jedi Knight and the younglings that she had been escorting to safety. And it was a pretty heavy situation the players got themselves into because they were instructed to kill the Jedi and her Padawan, not knowing that the Jedi was also harboring youngling refugees from Order 66. So yeah, it was pretty heavy. What else have I been up to? Help me out of this. What have I been doing? I've been doing a bit of...
It's like, you should know, you guys were all there.
I know. I've been doing a bit of video game development with my friend and friend of the podcast, Josh Bruce. So that's been a bit of an interesting learning process for both of us. He's doing all the hard work, I like to say, for the coding, and I'm helping him with the mechanics of the game, essentially, how everything works outside of the coding. That's what I've been doing. So
That sounds cool.
yeah.
Martin, what have you been up to?
Wow.
Wow.
Is that an exclamation or actual wow?
Both.
Right.
World of Warcraft. I've been playing that a lot.
What would Owen Wilson say about that?
Wow.
Wow.
Wow. What's Owen Wilson's favourite game?
Wow.
Right, very good.
Wow.
This could go on for a while.
Wow.
But I did that. I've been playing some Infinity with some of my close friends. Star Wars, L5R. I love L5R. The setting is amazing. That book's coming out soon.
It is. It's coming out on the 11th of October,
Yeah.
I think it is. So probably by the time that this hits the airwaves, the airwaves, that it'll be out. So it looks just from the artwork that we've seen on the website, it absolutely looks beautiful.
Yep.
Speaking of settings, etc., you know what we can talk about now?
Oh, yes, we can.
The fact that we play tested the Android book.
We can, but we can't talk about what's in it, but we can say that it's amazing.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. It's absolutely-
I just thought I'd add that there because I'm like, yes, this was amazing. I haven't been able to play any games with you guys lately, but that was definitely one that participated in, and I'm so excited for that book.
Yeah. It
So
looks really,
excited.
really good. So I think because they've sort of, on the website, that they've sort of advertised it as the generic sci-fi setting as well, but it's predominantly Android. So for those people who are really looking at playing like a Shadowrun type thing, it's absolutely fantastic. Which kind of brings me to another point of something that I think Mike found the other day, which was a 600-page or something like that epic monstrosity, which is someone's done a Shadowrun setting, which looks fantastic.
Fan made.
Yeah, fan-made book. Similar sort of vein as to the Arkham horror style book that we talked about not too long ago, which is 500-something pages. This is a 660-page Shadowrun book. Yeah, I can't take all the credit for finding that. Matt Wilson, he shared that to our Dice Pool community page, and then I've pushed that onto our Facebook main page. The book was written by, what was his name again?
Paul M.N. Harkinson. Hopefully I've said that right. But 663 pages of amazingness. I love the community.
It's massive.
I mean,
They're
even
great.
if you're not going to play in a Shadowrun campaign, all of that is good for us. It's sci-fi gold. So.
Absolutely right.
I went through a bit of a dig through it. He's added a lot of extra layers to the game, and I think that's what Shadowrun players sort of enjoy. So you get the best of both worlds. For my initial glance of this PDF, there's a lot of new rules like cybernetics and all these like fairly crunchy things, which Genesis by default hasn't got. He's added it here, but it appears to all work.
Yeah.
If you're a Shadowrun fan,
Give it a look.
it's a perfect book for you. If you want a cool cyberpunk setting that's quite deep, also a good book to start.
But yeah, they haven't given us a release date for Shadow of the Beanstalk yet, but I will be racing out to get that, and I know that we'll definitely have a review episode because we still haven't done a Terra North one yet.
We've talked about it.
We have.
It's true.
We'll have to do that, but we'll because Tim Cox has said that he will definitely come on the show to talk about that. So, which is really cool. But anyway, Kaitlin, what sort of gaming have you been up to?
Well, since the last episode, I haven't been able to get too much because I've been working lots, as I mentioned in the last episode, but also did a bit of traveling to New Orleans on the weekend. So I've been, doing a little bit of traversing around America and exploring a little bit. But pretty much what I've mainly been doing is a D&D campaign where I get to play my stealthy sneaky sneak rogue character, which is always fun to do. I haven't got to play a lot of those types of characters, particularly in a D&D 5th edition setting. So that's been really fun, and we've been doing that on a Sunday. So yeah, that's pretty much most of my gaming. Unfortunately, I need there to be more. I don't think I could ever have a max in my life, and I'm feeling like I need to rework my schedules around so I can add some more into my days because I'm certainly missing it.
Do it.
Indeed. So, Mike,
Yes.
Nick, what sort of gaming have you been up to?
Role-playing wise, quite a bit of stuff with you guys, in fact.
Yeah.
Mostly recently has been some L5R playtesting stuff, which has been a lot of fun for me because I used to GM that back in the day in the 80s when it was AEG published the original.
Yep.
I think it was the original version of that. So it's been good to revisit that whole world setting, which is so rich, and I love it. What Fantasy Flight have done with this new edition just like blows my mind in terms of the way the characters interact with the world setting and how that's so uniquely sort of threaded through the rule structure itself.
Yep.
So that's been a lot of fun doing that. We have been exploring different facets of that setting, which has been fun. We've been doing some intrigue stuff at the moment, and I know that's enjoyable, and I walk away feeling really frustrated as a player about the whole thing because I know it's engaged me completely in what's been going on, where I'm just like, I want to murder someone here. So that's been fun. So it's been great exploring all of that and learning the setting. And it is a big chunky tome in terms of a game and rules from my standpoint. So I think, from a player perspective, it would take me a while to get comfortable in that. But there's so much to it. There's so much to explore. It's amazing. So that's been a lot of fun. I did dabble in the Shadow the Beanstalk playtest stuff with you. GM Huzz ran a session I was involved in, and that was really fun. I've never really had exposure to that as a setting in Netrunner. And Mike, quite deliberately, I think, sent me some coffee table book about the world thing, and damn you. It's just amazing. Nope. It's so good as a sci-fi setting. And sci-fi is not normally my go-to in terms of genre. I'm more of a fantasy kind of a guy. So that was really interesting. Like the way they've pitched that whole world setting just as its background is awesome.
I feel that a lot of people, I see a lot of comments online, people just palm Android off as a fairly generic, it's just a generic cyberpunk setting. But it's really not. It's got its own unique themes.
Definitely.
It does borrow heavily from other cyberpunk settings, but what genre doesn't borrow from each other? But it's got its own very, very interesting things, and it's worth picking up the Android fluff book, or even just doing some wiki searches online. Deep dive into the lore, and you'll see that it's actually a really, really rich universe to roleplay in. Yeah. It's so diverse in what you can do.
Yeah, I think for me, and we'll get into this later on, my tendencies as a player and what floats my boat in terms of gameplay, Android does it for me because, as the creators talk about, they wanted a true sci-fi setting, and they also wanted to dialogue on real-world social issues through that. So there's so many hooks in there that people can instinctively relate to, and you can explore all of that in a safe setting because it is an imaginary world. And that, to me, is what makes it fun. So for me, it just ticked so many boxes. So that's been an awesome experience to be able to dabble in that. And other than that, from my gaming side of things, from a role-playing standpoint, I have been using my love of the Judge Dredd universe to start to learn more about Genesis because, again, Ian deliberately pushed Genesis onto me. He just said, it's just one little baggie, just take that. And, you can have it, it won't cost you anything. And here I am.
Mistake.
The first shot's free.
The best kind of mistake. The best kind of mistake.
Yeah, but and again, amazing. My exploration into Genesis as a game. It's been awesome, and I went straight into the deep end. So I went back to something that I love and know a lot about off the top of my head, and just started exploring the Judge Dredd universe and packaging up a few little bits and pieces, which the guys here have been happy to help me playtest and work some bugs out of. And once I feel that's robust enough, I'll share that with all the listeners as well.
That'll be cool.
And this is going to sort of come around full circle because we do have a listener request or question for someone to come onto the show to discuss their trials and tribulations of creating a setting. So, by happy circumstance, you happen to be here for that. So we thought we'd throw that question at you towards the show.
Yeah, that'd be good. So that's been fun. Yeah, and and it's been a long time for me to actually GM because I guess I have a love of all types of gaming. So and I, as life's gone on and different things come in and out of your experience, you tend to sort of pull the games in that you can manage to fit within your schedule. And for a long time, for various reasons, role playing hasn't been one of those things that I've been able to do, even though that's how I first got into gaming. So it's been nice to come back and re-explore that, and it's refreshing to re-experience it and realise just how much fun all of that is from my standpoint. Coming back as a veteran player. Cool. So having the opportunity to GM again has been awesome. So it's been fun for me. So I've been able to sit on both sides of the screens, and that's been great. Other than that, I've done a lot of other tabletop gaming, board games predominantly. I'm fortunate in my experience to have some networks into local games design. So I guess over the last 12 months, I've done a lot of stuff in looking at locally designed games here in Brisbane. So that's been a lot of fun. So it's been good.
Cool.
So how about you, Ian?
Look, I've pretty much done everything that you guys do because I don't socialise with anybody else. So I've been...
Because you don't need to.
No, I don't
We have
need
all
to.
of your
That's
social
right.
interactions here.
Exactly, but I've had the last week off on holidays.
That's right, you had the last week off, didn't you?
I did, because it's school holidays, and my son actually likes spending time with me. So we've been catching up on a few shows, going out a few places and whatever else. But Yeah, predominantly L5R, been really sort of sinking my teeth into that, as well as obviously doing some Star Wars. But I've sort of taken a backseat to GMing for a little bit, just to play, and it's been fun. So yeah, very, very good there. Yeah, that's pretty much all. Yes.
There's been one other thing you've been doing.
Yeah.
We sort of had a bit of a go at putting together some NPC entries for upcoming.
Yes, so I'm looking at converting the Legacy of Fire. I think I mentioned this the last episode.
We have, yeah.
Legacy of Fire for Pathfinder, and having a bit of a play around, and these wonderful little creatures called Pugwumpies. I've been trying to do the conversion for those. And they're so small, they're only going to be a minion group, but they're going to have some special rules attached to them.
So how many minions would you need to make a coat?
That refers to a previous...
Are we talking about minions like from Despicable Me, or...
Right, no, not that,
The Wampa things, whatever.
Pugwumpies.
Yeah, them.
Well, they're kind of like, strangely enough, they're kind of like little chihuahuas.
They're nasty.
But they're nasty as all. Anyway, moving along. So
you're describing a chihuahua. I'm like, oh.
But yeah, so yeah, that's been a lot of fun. Having a bit of a discussion with GM Flano about that, and GM Chris, who's also been throwing his hat in the ring with some of the conversions and thought processes behind that. So we'll be bringing that to the listeners on Facebook at a later stage, with another sort of conversion article type thing. That's pretty much all of what we've been up to. Yeah.
No, it's the end of the show.
It was awesome being here, thank you.
Shouldn't that be, that thing, that segue type deal, core of the show?
Seems like you're already setting that already, GM Flano.
Well, in that case, it's time for Core of the Show. Core of the Show. And welcome to Core of the Show, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning the Genesis role-playing game and, of course, gaming in general. Now, tonight we bring you a topic that isn't strictly related to Genesis, but is no less a large dynamic of it, and that is player archetypes. Now, this is often overlooked in tabletop gaming, something most people probably haven't even stopped to consider. The theory behind what makes us players tick and how we'll ultimately function as a group when playing out our favourite games, be it a humble board game, all the way up to RPGs, such as Genesis. Now, this is where we've wheeled Michael onto the show, as he's been the driving force behind this topic. And to the point that he's designed a number of things which we'll discuss during the episode to allow people to get a better understanding of what sort of players they have at the table and what sort of people that they want to invite to the next gaming session. Firstly, before we go any further, Michael, and now I know that you've talked about what sort of gaming that you've done, but perhaps you can sort of tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, where to begin? I guess I'll start at the beginning. Well, my foray into gaming started when I was 13 years of age. And at that time, my family had moved from Sydney, where I was born and grew up, to the Gold Coast. And I came to sort of a new area, and I basically didn't know anyone. And as luck would have it, I came across another person who was in a similar circumstance who'd sort of moved in. And I guess because we were sort of on the outer of the social circles at that time, we forged a bit of a friendship, and over one of our gatherings, usually on rainy days when we were stuck inside because we couldn't get out and ride our bikes around, we would look for other things to do. And he said to me on one day, "Oh, do you like playing games?" And I went, "Yeah, I love games. Yeah, I've played heaps of Scrabble and Monopoly and Connect 4 and because at that stage, games to me were things that you bought at Target and other department stores. I didn't really sort of have much more experience other than that."
Yep.
And he said, "No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this thing I used to play back in Canada." And I've gone, "What's that about? This sounds odd." And he said, "Well, it's Dungeons and Dragons." I've never heard of it. And he said, "It's really cool."
Yep.
And so he's described to me what that was all about. And you have to understand, like, I grew up with an Irish father from Belfast in Northern Ireland, so my staple upbringing was of, fairy tales and dragons and stories and
Lord of the Rings.
That was my bedtime story. Yeah. My father used to read to me at night time. So as soon as he sort of said, "Oh yes, well, you get to play this character, and it's there's dragons and there's wizards and you get to be the hero of the story," and I've gone, "Yeah,
hell yeah,
that's me. Where do we start?" So that was sort of how I got into it, and role playing was a big thing for many, many years through those sort of school ages, and we played heaps of all those sort of classic games back in the 80s. That led to me buying my very first role playing game, which was the James Bond role playing game by Victory Games,
right?
Which I still have on the shelf at home.
Cool.
So I sort of collected all these things. They've got a lot of nostalgic value for me. So yeah, that sort of went from there, and mostly. I guess, I don't know, it's too many games to recall specifically. Like Rollmaster was something that I played a lot as a GM. That was my sort of work from GMing the James Bond role-playing game. Rollmaster was my next thing.
Oh, Table Master.
It was Table Master, but I got into that because at that time they were the company that held the license for Middle-earth role-playing.
Right.
So that
ICE, was it?
Yeah, ICE, yeah. Iron Crown Enterprises.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was a way for me, again, to sort of get into the thing that I grew up with through that experience of being able to reimagine all that sort of stuff. And this, I want people to think about what I'm talking about now later in the episode when we talk about player archetypes, because what I'm sharing now is hinting at what my archetype is. And
that you've sort of developed over time.
Yeah, well, because I did in gaming the things that I enjoyed. And I think most of us naturally do that.
Sure.
Given the choice, we will naturally pursue the things that make us happiest. Gaming's no different. So I got involved in gaming, playing the games and running the games that appealed to me for certain reasons.
Yep.
So for Rollmaster, it was because I could play in Middle-earth at those times, right?
Of course.
So, and from there, as time went on and, I discovered Games Workshop and miniature wargaming around that same time as well. They got into role playing. Back then, it was Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, and over the years, I sort of ebbed and flowed in and out of different types of gaming depending on what was happening sort of in my life. So as I went to uni, I still did a lot of role playing, but got more into miniatures because they were a bit easier to get up and run and play in terms of the commitment. And then as family comes into play. Again, you have periods of being time poor, so it's about trying to fit in your gaming around what the real life is happening. So, my experience is in board games and card games and all that sort of stuff, and along the way have been involved in a lot of clubs. So my very first club that I was involved in was down the Gold Coast after I finished uni. I think that would have been about 93. And I helped with a couple of other people to establish Dominion Gold Coast Gaming Club, which ran for about 6
years. I didn't know you were involved in that.
Yeah, I set that up with a mate of mine, Dion, and that ran for about 6 years. And then I took up some employment that took me away for a little while and sort of moved on from that, and then ended up sort of here in Brisbane and got involved in other clubs around during my time here in Brisbane. And that's where I came to know you.
It is. Yeah. It is. Yeah, with Queensland Gamers Guild.
That's right.
That we've sort of generated after, I think it was, we ran the big weekend in 2002. And then we said, look, we can do it a little bit better than that. And that's where we developed QGG. And that's sort of our first connection that we have. So, yeah.
Yeah, so, the big weekend, running that games convention, which was good. That was a big experience. And then through QGG, Queensland Gamers Guild, in particular Oktoberfest, the major event for that. Ran a lot of the
name.
Yeah. Ran a lot of the miniature games for there and fantasy side of things. So I guess for me, my involvement in gaming's been across a broad range of different gaming, and I've liked to be involved in that event, sort of coordinating type of things. As time went on, and I guess my interest sort of evolved and developed in different ways as time went on. It sort of led me to what I'm sort of doing now in gaming, which is I decided that I'd open up a business called Conexio Games Cafe, which is here in Brisbane in Albany Creek on the north side. So that's sort of my latest, I guess, event related sort of organisation in that space of trying to create a place that's for families as well as gamers to sort of come together so that we have this inclusive space. It's about giving people a chance to come in and hang out and share this hobby that we love so much. And I wanted to be something that would, have that broad appeal, that would be welcoming for people who were curious but perhaps never done it before.
Yep.
So that's what we've sort of been aiming for there, and that seems to be, we're still pretty new. We're only about a year old now. So still a long way to go as a business. But it's through that I started to sort of think about this concept of, what brings people to play and how people get all that enjoyment from it. And that's what's led on to what we'll talk about today.
Cool. All right. We should get into this discussion.
Yes. Looking forward to it.
Now, today we might get a little bit deep, a little bit meta, as you will, as we talk about people's personality types, attitudes, their sort of personal reactions to things, and that sort of thing. So, Michael, can you tell us what sort of qualifications you bring to the table and why you got involved in this area of study to begin with?
I guess I can start by saying that my academic background is in psychology.
Right.
I've hold a degree in that space and also studied a number of interrelated sort of areas in that regard. And I guess that's where my weird fascination with people watching stems from, I think. Either that or that was there beforehand, and I studied psychology to try and disarm people in a charming way. But, I guess from that standpoint, I've always found people fascinating, and I find it interesting the way we work and the way we tick. My fundamental belief in that space is that we always bring that stuff with us no matter how we walk through life and all the things we do. So the leisure time we spend in this space is no different. I've been, in many ways, I've always worked in that kind of space dealing with people. It's more so that my work my employment over 25 years has always dealt with people, whether it's been, no matter what I've done. Like I've worked in organisational psych spaces, and other people related careers. Along the way, it's always been about, how we do what we do. That's what's kept me interested and kept me fascinated. And,
in short, we've been ordered to bring the psychologist to the show to maintain. So he has to be here for court reasons.
He's got his work cut out for him.
Yeah. Ostensibly today, I came to attach the anklet bracelets to the hosts for the show,
and he was surprised because they already had two.
Yeah, and I was also surprised that one of them apparently already fled the country.
Right.
This had escaped out.
That one malfunctioned.
But
why do you think I'm wearing two? The second one's Kaitlin's. So they still think she's in the country.
Taking one for the team. I appreciate you.
Good on you, mate. So one of the things that is obviously troubles some players, generally speaking, or some GMs, is the sort of people that they have at the table. So whether it be, what the dynamic is that, and they can learn things as they progress. But what you've sort of, and the reason why we've brought you on the show, is to discuss how that you can sort of develop that more quickly so that you can understand who you have at the table.
And who you are as a player.
Yeah, exactly. Because not everybody is necessarily aware of what makes them tick, what they actually enjoy.
Yeah.
They might understand it in a general sense, but certainly not sort of from a nitty-gritty, this is the sort of the archetype, to bring a Genesis term into it, of what you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think fundamentally, and this is my very to the point, perhaps blunt view, is that most people out there in the world blunder through life like a sleepwalk. They really don't have an insight into what drives and what their motivations are. Some people think they know, but often those things that they think are driving them are really their surface reactions to responses that come from deeper core needs. So that's my whirlwind, and very cheap, dime, psychology talk on that. In that aspect, we all have things that drive us. Like fundamentally, we have beliefs and values about the world, and they colour the way we view things, and that forms the basis of what we decide is good and bad in terms of our experience. So having some understanding of those temperaments, which is the basic concept, then leads us to be able to make more informed decisions about everything we do in life. Fundamentally, this works in our social frameworks and our social interactions, which I think role-playing is built on. It's about people coming together around a table and actually being able to interact together in a constructive manner to create this, what should be thoroughly entertaining and socially rewarding experience. And I would argue that if you go away not having that, then you're probably not doing something right.
And it's also good as well to consider when you're around the table, or if you're a GM or creating these types of games, is to recognize that, like, the archetypes of your other players, so that you can actually create and put together a story that meets all those needs that you were talking about that your players have, so that they can walk away with those feelings, and that you can create games that meets everyone's drivers.
Yeah, absolutely, Kat. And I think that's the next level on top of that. That's the sort of advanced topic of it, is first understanding what drives you, so that you develop those insights, and then it's developing the acceptance and an attitude of welcomingness about all the other people who come to your table as well.
And it's probably a good time to
100%.
mention. It's probably a good time to mention that a lot of people might be thinking this is us trying to, like, a GM might be trying to exclude players or something like that from a group. It's not. It's not a witch hunt at all. It's about finding what group of people you best synergize with.
Well, and finding ways to incorporate those players that may not necessarily...
By understanding them.
Exactly, and bringing them into it.
Yeah, so at a broad level, the way that I view this is that there are... In broad brushstrokes, there's two ways that I would be approaching a game if I was running them. One is that I'm coming together with my group of friends and I'm having a social experience by using the game as a medium to hang out and share that company. In which case, me accepting how each of those people are is fundamental to making that happen.
Absolutely.
The other side of that, well, not the other side, but the other option that I might have is that as a GM, I may want to explore some topic through my storytelling and role-playing. I may want to be exploring a theme or a mood or a setting. And then, whatever that is not so relevant, but what that may mean is that for me to succeed in that outcome or that intention for the game, I may need certain types of players to whom that intention is better suited for.
It's going to be interesting and engaging for them.
For them, that's right, because there's some things that I may want to do as a GM in setting up my intention, which you would do in your session 0.
Yep.
To say, this is what I'm going to do and this is what it's going to be about. So if I reflect that back on my own experience, I decided that I would run a game in a fantasy setting, and my premise for the game was, what are you willing to die for? So what that meant in my session 0 is I said to people, if your character dies here, your participation in this game is done. Because I needed that choice to have a finality to it. And what that did is that drove certain thoughts and certain interactions for the players. Now, for some people, that concept is not going to work, and that's okay. So it's about saying, as a GM, this is what I want to explore, and this is what I'd like to do, and this is what it's going to mean for you as a player. Having some insight into who you are as a player then allows you to make an informed choice about, am I going to like that? And if I am, great, then let me do it. Am I not going to naturally like that? In which case, am I prepared to be flexible as a player to support the premise of what this session is about? And if I'm not, that's okay too. In which case, you don't play.
Yeah.
And it's not about excluding you.
No.
It's
about choice.
Exactly.
It's about giving people choice, but it's about informed choice.
Yep. Now, this process is basically, as far as its placement and where it occurs, this is the sort of thing that you might be doing before you run a session 0.
Exactly.
So that you're going through, so as far as, referring back to episode 2, when we did our discussion on session 0, these are the sorts of things that when you're going out trying to find your players, that you might have already done this as a bit of a fun thing to work out where everybody's percentages are, and then go, right, well, this is the sort of game that I want to play. Is this going to suit that? And as Martin said, it's not a judgmental thing by any stretch. It is basically just talking about giving the GM or the person who's running the game the tools to work out who they want at the table.
Yeah.
or who's going to best suit that style of storytelling.
What I was going to add is that whilst this sounds technical in terms of our discussion, the thing is that we're making these choices all the time. We just don't realise we're making them.
Yep.
So if we talk about it in terms of games, each game designer sets out with an intention about the sort of experience they want people to have through the game that they're designing. So each game comes with an implicit intention behind it. Now, not every game is going to suit every type of player.
Otherwise, everybody would be buying every single game, and all game designers and manufacturers would be ludicrously rich.
That's right. And if everyone loved every game, and if everyone loved every game that was out there, there literally would be no purpose for the internet to exist.
So I think
There'd be no forums for people to complain on.
That's right.
you just got to make it a nice shiny hardcover book, and I'll buy it. Like that's what's in it. I don't know, but the cover's amazing.
That's right. And that is actually an aspect of the player archetypes.
Yeah,
We'll talk about that later. But yeah, look, those decisions are being made all the time. Both as GMs in terms of the type of games we want to run and the sorts of things we instinctively want to create and design and draw. The same for us as players about those games that we want to participate in. Games are being designed and motivated from that basic intention as well.
Genesis isn't necessarily for everyone. It is a narrative game, and we touched on this in the last episode, is that, when you're getting into what you want to play, you look at the system and you look at, is this going to best suit what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you've got people who are very much into the non-narrative sort of games, like 4th edition D&D, where it was very much about on the table, working out, it was almost very much a simulationist attitude for playing a game. You may not be looking for people who are really story-driven.
Yeah.
You may not be looking for people who are all about immersion. It just depends.
And you can pick your game, the system that you're using to match this
exactly.
as well.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the whole idea about it, is it's this concept of the right tool for the right job. So when you set out to do whatever you're doing in your role-playing experience, you will have an idea in mind of what it is that you want to run as a GM. As a player, you come with similar thoughts. What is it that I want to experience as a player? Sometimes it might just be to have fun. Great. It might also be other things for other people. Sometimes those reasons are not always conscious in people's mind, and that's the whole purpose of this as a tool, is to help to bring some of that thinking into conscious awareness. And it's not meant to be, a personality test in terms of pigeonholing you into one concept. It's just give you a framework with which you can start to reflect on how you gain your enjoyment through gameplay, no matter what the game is.
I think it sounds, if you listen to this concept for the first time, it almost sounds very dystopian. But it's not at all. It's not meant to be whatsoever. But
it's supposed to be a little bit of fun, so that you can, as a GM, you've got an idea of how you can meet the player's needs better to make you a better GM.
And your own needs, because the GM's a player too.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to bring that back again to something personal in terms of our experience, last episode, Ian made reference to a conversation that came out of a game that we were playing where, in short, he was saying that he wasn't sure that he was meeting the needs of one of the players. That was me.
Yes.
Right? And it didn't come up in conversation in that way. It was more that GM Hooly was being what I consider to be a good GM, and at the end of the session he said, how did that go? And we all had fun. And GM Hooly then asked, is there anything else, you got any feedback for me? Is there anything else that I can consider in doing that? And I think that's a great attribute as a GM, to constantly seeking that feedback from their players to go, am I on track here? Is everyone having a good time? Could I be making it better for you? And as will be revealed and talked about later on, in terms of my styling, because I tend to be a little bit more immersive in terms that I love getting into the world setting and what I can imagine that's in the scene and all those sorts of things, I just said, a little bit more description about the scenes would really work for me. And that prompted a whole range of different discussions, which then basically led us to sitting here where we are today. But it's that dynamic of tapping into what is it what ticks the boxes for people, what works well, and being able to accommodate
your
those.
enjoyment.
Yes, what drives your enjoyment.
So Give us the nuts and bolts of what it is that you've come up with as far as your game theory, for want of a better term.
Yeah, okay. I guess this came together for me because of my background in the psych space. I was tending to think about things in these terms anyway. And where it sort of coalesced into coming into something tangible that we're going to talk about today is I set up a business called Conexio Games Cafe. So we're a licensed cafe restaurant here in Brisbane. We also have a library of games that people can come in and buy, and a retail store in that space. Now, part of what that business was about is about bringing people together over the tabletop to play games as an important facet of their social connection. And that goes into a whole range of social discussions about the need for that and for people to be healthy and so on. So that was sort of what drove a lot of that stuff as well. And so because I wanted to, not just to be about games and playing fun, which it is about as well, but I also wanted it to be something useful for people to come together and actually improve their relationships with other human beings. I wanted to make sure the business supported people who weren't necessarily into gaming. So we target a big family market in that of having people to come in. But when your average person comes in and is faced with about 450 games in a library of all different sorts of types, they just glaze over like deers in the headlight, and they don't know where to start.
With Conexio, you've got a bit of a unique experience too, because not like a gaming store. When you walk into a gaming store, most people who walk into a gaming store are gamers.
That's right.
You own a cafe, and people who walk in will go, "Oh, I'm going to get a coffee. What's all this about?"
Exactly.
So you're mashing potentially two different walks of life together.
Exactly. Because for a lot of people, they haven't played games since they were a kid. But if you stop them and say, what was that like? They go, oh, it was amazing. We had so much fun, and we used to do family game nights and all this kind of stuff. And there's always these fond memories about things. And that was the thing that I realised over time in my life, is that it's always those little things that stick with you, those things that make the greatest memories and what bond us as, for people together. And games, as Kat was sharing before, her experience of playing games is so heavily entwined in her social experience, and she has so much fun in that, and that actually creates a goodness in her as a person, which she wants to then share with other people. And that's the same kind of motivation that's drove me and what we tried to underpin in terms of the values of that business. But what I wanted to do is make sure that people had some tools to assist them in going, well, what game do I play? Because there's so many games here, I don't even know what 95% of those things are, because I haven't played games since, I was 11, and that was Monopoly, and then bad because Uncle Joe flipped the table, and, and all this, these sorts of all these things that go on. So I started off by looking at what research was out there in this space, because I thought there's so many different personality tests and types and stuff out there that have to be something. And interestingly, there actually wasn't anything. All I was able to find was one commercially generated bit of research in this space, which was largely targeted at massive multiplayer online games, trying to look at how do we get a broader market appeal in that space. And they did quite a good, very extensive questionnaire in that space, very interesting to read, broke down people into a number of different types, great marketing tool, great way of figuring out how do we design elements in games to attract more people, and way too complicated for your average player. There was a couple of other little small sort of, I think they were university topics or subjects that people had done, that have done some tests in that space, which were interesting to read as well. But again, it didn't really sort of coalesce it into a nice little succinct way of doing that. So I went back onto my experience and studies with personality types, and then sort of settled in reading those other research. I noticed a common thread between what they were showing and what's known as temperament theory, which is basically really simplified personality tests.
Right.
So I kind of just read through all of that stuff and distilled it down into something fairly simple for myself, into what is now a questionnaire, which I refer to as the Player Archetype Quiz.
And we've all had a bit of a go at this before.
We have.
Before the recording.
Yes.
And we've yet to see the results.
So I guess the question is, what are player archetypes? The way that I define them is that player archetypes is just... they're meant to be a simple and fun way for you to understand or describe the way in which you gain enjoyments out of tabletop games. Now, it doesn't matter what the game is. It can be computer games as well, but any kind of gaming, you'll fundamentally be satisfying certain needs in playing those games if you're having fun. So essentially, it is just meant to be a guide Really, really simple guide. You answer the quiz, you get a result from it, and it will define you by one of 4 player archetypes. So the way that I've called, or the terms that I use to describe those 4 archetypes are the creative player, the immersive player, the social player, and the competitive player. So no tricks there. Those titles are meant to be pretty self-explanatory.
Yep.
And what I would hope is that if this little quiz is at least reasonably accurate, you should be able to do it, get a result, read the description, and go, yep, you know what, that doesn't surprise me at all. But what it means is that you'll at least have brought out into the open and into your sort of conscious thought how you sit in terms of those frameworks. The other cool thing about doing a little quiz like this is that it does give a common language that you as players and GM around a table can start to discuss these things and also poke fun at each other.
Well, we already started doing that as well. Like when we were going through my quiz, it was you already had my answers for me based on what you've heard from the podcast as well. So
well, that's right, because
it's pretty simple.
Yeah, I think most people who've listened to the podcast for a while would realise that Kat wears her heart on her sleeve.
Right.
Aw,
That's not.
I hope that's a good thing.
That is a good thing.
It is.
That is a good thing. Absolutely, because it means you're being genuine in the way in which you present yourself to the world, and I think that's awesome.
But I think what you said is like hitting the nail on the head. The best thing about this, from my perspective, is creating that common language. Because if we have no way or means of communicating what we know, it's impossible to be heard and impossible to reach or meet your needs at the table. Because language is part of what makes us civilized.
Very true.
Oh, I don't know about that. I have been looking at Facebook lately. People know how to talk. I don't think a lot of people know how to listen when their own language.
No,
so.
it's true.
And some of the stuff I say is not civilized.
Okay.
But that's why we get along so well, Michael. I mean, Huzz, GM Huzz. I'm sure Michael and I get along fine, you know. But in terms of being horrible people, you know, Huzz and I got that down pat, even though I wear my heart on my sleeve.
It's because they haven't listened to the After Dark podcast, so they don't know how horrible we actually are.
Yes.
Exactly. I can't wait for that.
Oh, God, people. No, but that's it. It enables that capability, our ability to communicate and be heard.
Yep.
And that's, creating a common language.
That's right, because fundamentally all words have meaning, and the words you use are not as important as the meaning that they convey.
Yeah.
So you need to have some framework to which to interpret the meaning that's being shared. And, you know, this is just, it is meant to just be a very, very simple way of doing that. And the idea is it's meant to be fun and lighthearted. So in the quiz, there's a little funny pop culture quotes to give you a little bit of a giggle at, and hopefully, bring you back to those things that a lot of us come around the table to sort of re-experience. And also hopefully clarify what the questions are about as well.
Yeah.
But it's just meant to be a little bit of fun.
Can we hear a little bit about what each of those categories mean?
Yes.
Because even though the words are self-explanatory, as far as it certainly generates an image in my mind of what each of those categories mean, but sort of can we talk a little bit more about
common language?
Yes, so that people have got a framework of where to look at.
Sure, absolutely. So first up, I would say, and this may be obvious to some people, but I suspect maybe not to others as well, is that no one archetype's inherently better than another. Okay, we all actually have aspects of each of the archetypes as I describe them within us. They come out in different ways against different systems, depending on the experience you want to play at the time, or you want to have at the time. So, no one's better than the other. They're just different ways of experiencing the game or different preferences that people might have. The other thing that's true that I can say about these things is that they do interrelate with each other. So some of them are more closely related to others. So you can lay this out on a little diagram and you can sort of see visually how this all works. But for example, to give you one example is competitive players, interestingly, are actually related to social players. And you might not think that, right? It might seem counterintuitive, but a competitive player can be a person who is all about mastering the mechanics of the game and beating the game. Now, in certain types of gameplay, that can be true. It might be you against the computer. But it also might be you against another person, like in a classic, say, CCG type setting where it's a head-to-head type competition. It's about you competing against another person. So
PvP.
It's pretty hard to compete against yourself, really.
It's been
Okay,
I
let's
don't
not
know
go
about
into the psychology of that.
Yeah, I was going to say, we do have a psychologist here. Let's bring out all of our inner demons.
It's been known to happen. So there's different. My point being is that they are related to each other.
Yeah.
Having said that, even though you might use the example that a competitive player is closely related to a social player because it can be about competing against other people in a friendly way. There are some player archetypes that are more opposite to each other. So in those circumstances, you may have some conflicts in terms of what players want to get out of what they're doing. So, yes, there can be differences in the archetypes, but one's not better than the other, is what I'm saying. So we talked about competitive players initially. So, for example, if we're talking about them and we're talking about it more from a mechanic, like a systems perspective or the game perspective, they're the sort of people who would enjoy directly affecting the environment of the game. So if we're looking at role-playing settings, that'll be about how they can influence what happens as a course of conduct within the game world and game setting. They also would be people who would prefer, combat or tactical focused things. So, if we're looking at a classic fantasy setting, they'd want to play the fighter.
Yep.
Okay. But they can also want to play tactical roles, which would include things like healers, because of what they can do within the game from a tactical perspective in a supporting capacity. There can also be the sorts of people who may love spending hours contemplating their perfect combination of how they're going to play their game. So they might sit in character creation and won't be able to do it around the table with the other players. They'll want to actually sit and play with numbers and come up with ideas and spend a lot of time thinking about how they're actually going to bring together the mechanics of their character for the game.
Yep.
They do have a tendency in that perspective that the outcome they're trying to achieve is more about efficiency in the game than it is about it making some kind of flavour or making it cool. Okay.
And that's competitive play. Yeah? Or
that's a competitive. Yeah, competitive players more focused on systems, but likewise, because they relate into the social space as well, they can be people who thrive on competition with other people. So they like to pit themselves against another person. So your classic chess player would be a good example of that. You can also have some miscreant attributes coming up in these sorts of players, where sometimes they can be people who like to sow destruction and create chaos in the game just because it's fun to do so. Yeah. Not because it's in character of whatever they're playing, but they just like to throw a spanner in the works at times. And that's their way of fighting boredom in a game. But they also can be people who are highly involved in the social or economic aspects of the game as well. And a lot of that is about aspects of market control or political power in the game. And that's how you start to see the competitive aspect moving into the social space.
On a quick aside, this survey, could you apply that to 2 or more fields of gaming? Like, for example, I would apply a different filter to that when I'm talking about tabletop gaming, but apply a completely different filter when I'm talking about my PC gaming.
Yeah. Because
I'm not a competitive player when it comes to tabletop, but put me on a PC and on a game like Rainbow Six, I thrive on that.
Yeah.
But on tabletop, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So could you apply what you're doing here, to 2 different mediums?
Absolutely, yeah. And like with any quiz that you do, especially if you're talking about something that's trying to shed a light or give you insight into temperament, there's lots of different external factors that influence the results you get out of any kind of quiz. So I would suggest to people that they come in with the intention of either thinking about a certain type of game. So it's like, since we're talking about Genesis and it's role-playing, then I would imagine most of the listeners are in that space and interested in that sort of stuff. So, yeah, come at it from a role-playing perspective. Okay. What do I like to, what makes a good role-playing game awesome for me? And come with that intention in mind, and that will flavour the results you get. Likewise, you can redo the test and think about in terms of PC gaming or board games or whatever, or you can literally just think about it generally in terms of gaming as a whole. If I don't think about medium, what type of gaming experiences make things better for me? So yeah, absolutely.
I think that feeds in well as when we were doing the quiz before the episode. You asked me one of the questions of like, do you sow destruction or create chaos and all that kind of stuff and pitting against each other. And whilst when I've played games in terms of like, and a good example would be Sea of Thieves, I did do a lot of that with other players and had an amazing fun time doing it. But when I think about myself as a player, doing that just for the sake of doing that isn't where I get enjoyment from the game. If it's in character and that's how the story goes, then yes, fantastic. In Sea of Thieves, you're a pirate. That is what you do. If you attack another ship that happens to have other players on it, guess what? You're in a pirate game. That's how the world works. But if I'm in an RPG game and I go into player versus player type of thing, and I'm actually going, confronting them or anything like that, that's outside of character, that's not where I get enjoyment and actually can make me feel uncomfortable around the table when players do that, because that's not where I have fun. And I think feeding onto that as well is that everyone's going to be different around the table. And whilst, as you said, every category of this is equal, it can give you insight into, well, that's that person having fun. Necessarily it might not be me, but this is them having fun around the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because fundamentally everyone's there for their own reasons. They're not, well, hopefully, they're not there to cause problems for other people, right?
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
They are. Maybe reconsider them.
But it's just interesting that you can actually use this as a tool to recognize what you find enjoyment out of, and then also maybe use it as a tool to not let other people that might be at a direct opposite to you impact your level of enjoyment in the game. Like, I know sometimes it might make me uncomfortable, but looking at this and looking at and understanding, and as you say, breaking a common language, everyone having a common ground, gives me a different level of appreciation when I look at the actions and that other players take around the table. So next time when I'm at a game and someone does do inter-party conflict or anything like that, that's not necessarily what I would feel is narrative driven, more as maybe that chaos and destruction driven, I might take a little bit more of a less personal approach to that and go, well, that's just that person having fun, and that's how they want to have fun. And it's not as me being a social character and that kind of thing turns me off or, makes me uncomfortable, or just that I'm not as good at doing that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. It's just how they want to have fun, and I have fun in a different way.
Yeah. It also allows to make sure that your games don't get a little bit too swayed towards one, because that let's say that you had a competitive player that still meets the needs of the group generally, and if they've suddenly decided to go off on a tangent, and they may have a strong personality, and so they're suddenly grabbing onto the table as such to draw them into what their desires are, but that doesn't necessarily meet everybody else's. It's important for the GM to know that, so the GM can say, okay, that's cool, let's now move that, because ultimately being a GM is also being a people manager.
Absolutely.
That you've just got to be very, very careful of that. So, yeah. It's sort of extending on to what GM Kaitlin was just saying. Knowing the archetypes of everyone at the table, and this is from the perspective of a player, not just the GM, it allows each player to then sort of meet in the middle. Okay, you like this, you like that, cool. We can mesh this together fairly well, then we can gel it together and make a good medium. Because when we play, each of us at the table have our own likes, but we realise that and we sort of just...
You accommodate.
You go with it.
You accommodate. That's exactly it. We all come together in the middle and go, well, this is the best medium for all of us to enjoy, and off we go. Yeah. And yes, you might be a player who likes sowing destruction, but also that player has to recognise that may upset people. And this is like almost the complete opposite of what Kaitlin was saying. That player will then have to recognise, all right, I enjoy doing this. Other players are respecting my choice of doing this. However, I should tone that down somewhat and meet the other players' expectations just like they're meeting mine. So if everyone's doing that correctly, it sort of balances out and meets in the middle. Everyone understands that for initially.
And a new level of appreciation as well. Like, because sometimes if you don't have that understanding or that common ground or thing, and I know, I'm sorry, I have sidetracked from the conversation of going through each of the archetypes, but, it's just one of those ones that gives you a deeper insight so that when people do make those actions around the table, you have a bit more of an understanding about why that decision has been made. And, not always as they're just wanting to cause like destruction or whatever. It's to have fun, which is what we all should be doing and striving for anyway.
Absolutely.
So that's competitive.
That's the competitive player, yes. Yep. So if we rolled around and looked at the social player, This, and we're talking about player orientations. This is in terms of their overall focus in the game. So a social player is someone who would enjoy sharing their experiences of the games that they play with other people. And that's the sort of thing where you'd sit around and you might have a cuppa with someone and you regale stories about the games that you've, and adventures that you've been through. But it can also be people who have a tendency to like to help people out with games, like to help them learn a new game or invite them to participate in a new game to share the experiences that you've been having.
That's not us at all, is it?
No. Those sorts of people would never, ever start a podcast.
Wait, this is a podcast?
Oh, didn't you know that?
We've been recording this entire time.
Why didn't anyone tell me?
Just remember that
I feel
anklet
betrayed.
requires a special key to come
Lies.
off.
I thought there was a spit guard in front of me. What is this?
But I think as well, I think I even mentioned this in one of the other, probably one of the original episodes, but one of my most favorite things about gaming in general is that when you get a whole bunch of gamers together, very rarely do we talk about what we're actually doing in our lives. We talk about what our characters did last week.
Yeah.
And we do the same thing here. And I just love it. It's one of the best things that we've not even last week, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 10 years ago,
Stories.
characters that stick with you for the rest of your life. I love that.
Yeah. And that's certainly an aspect of the social player. That's one of their sort of key traits is they love to have those sorts of experiences. So the social player is also someone who would enjoy forming guilds, having kinships or pacts with other people in the game. So that's sort of focused more on the actual social bonds between players, and it could also be between NPCs in a game setting, like in role-playing. They would also, they may also enjoy going to tournaments, which seems counterintuitive in some respects, but the reason that they're there is so that they can hang out with other people who love the game that they want to play. So they don't really care about how well they do or where they rank or whether they pick up an award or anything like that. They're just there for the social aspects of hanging out with other people, in a convention-like setting, probably. Social players also have a focus on interaction, of being interaction-orientated, which probably sounds a little bit more intuitive for them. They usually would prefer more casual, non-tournament styles of play, if we're talking about games more broadly. From an RPG standpoint, I guess that would lean them more towards the social interaction aspects of the game, where it's more narrative, than the combat aspects of the game, where it's much more structured. They would also gain the most enjoyment out of their interactions with other players at the table, and also with other NPCs as well. Which effect is voiced through the GM being the extra player, as GM Flano talked about before. Oh, and the big thing, well, I think we sort of touched on this as well earlier, is that social players can often be players whose social network is very heavily made up of people that they've met through gaming circles. So they sort of run through your list of friends, and if you don't hang out with anyone that hasn't got anything to do with the gaming, then this possibly could be you.
Feeling a little attacked right now.
It's not a social disorder, people.
No. Kaitlin said that before, and I think that applies to pretty much all of us. Yes.
But she still fled the country.
To another gamer. Anyway.
So that's the social player. So if we keep rolling around, and we can talk about immersive players. So immersive players share that sort of...
Not to be confused with submersive players,
which
they play
is
underwater.
Completely different.
Commonly known as synchronized swimmers.
Wow. Submersive players. Yes,
I am a
Michael.
submersive player.
Or a subversive player.
Oh. Intrigue.
Never trust an elf.
Or a sub player.
Wow, that's just a little bit too much. Okay.
We're all thinking about it. I mean, really thinking it.
Michael, you were saying, yes.
So we could have a little bit of chat about immersive players. So immersive players share an interaction orientation with the social player, so they kind of are related in that space as well. They would be people who could be characterized as enjoying and sharing their experiences of games with other people as well. They will also love to play games that allow them to re-experience their love of a favourite book, TV series, a movie, or even a historical event. They also have a tendency to prolifically quote TV shows and movies.
Wow.
I'm looking at you. GM Kaitlin.
Don't know what you're talking about.
No, I only poke fun at you because this is who I am.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
And they're the sort of people who will also enjoy the flavour of the role-playing elements of the game, especially if we're talking like in any gaming system. Some games obviously don't have this. Most games still have some kind of role-playing aspect to it where you have to characterise something to do with the setting. In a role-playing game system, I hope that a lot of people would figure out for themselves that even though you might be playing a role-playing game, you don't actually have to be heavily involved in the role-playing elements of the game. It can be much more dungeon crawl, grindy experience if that's what you like. Okay. Immersive players also have what they call a setting orientation. So they're people who love to learn about the backstory and the lore of a game setting. So if we're talking about games in general, they probably don't care so much about the mechanics of the game, just as long as, not just as long as, but they're not focused on that. What they're more interested in is the game as a whole, and the whole experience they can get out of playing the game is more important than, is the game this refined piece of mechanical engineering.
Yeah.
They'll also enjoy games that require them to pay attention to details and solve puzzles. So they'll be sort of people who might like investigative flavoured role-playing games, for example. Or, I don't know, L5R Intrigue.
I like to say I put mine as a middle score for that one on my survey, and somehow yet my character is leading this investigation in our L5R Intrigue because everyone else is too distracted by other things.
Going on.
Picking fights with guards.
Moving on.
Right, so yes, the immersive player would also be the sort of person who would love to explore the boundaries of the game setting itself, and would probably take a lot of enjoyment in sort of breaching those boundaries and taking it into unexplored sort of territory, places where the game wasn't intended to actually go.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it. So for the immersive player, creative player. Alrighty, which is the last one on the list to have a bit of a chat about. So the creative player shares a relationship with the immersive player through that setting orientation that we've just been talking about. So they're the sort of person who would enjoy, if we're talking about CCGs, for example, as a good metaphor, they would enjoy creating decks. But the focus of their decks is about building theme within that deck.
Yep.
You can relate that to the role-playing setting from a character creation process, that their character creation is about building the stats of a character around a concept or theme that they have for that character. These creative players are also people who may get a sense of prestige from gaining levels and advances or little rare widgets and either items they might get in the game, particularly if those things actually have no tangible in-game benefit. They're just kind of cool to have.
Like an eye patch.
Like an eye patch.
Like an eye patch. Right. For those who don't know, and I'm sure we've mentioned it a couple of times on the show, every single character.
I wouldn't say every single, but it's very close.
You've got to think about eyes.
I do.
They're either blind or they've
I think
got
you
an
mean
eye patch.
singular, not plural.
I see what you did there.
I've played 2 blind characters now.
Wow.
Yep.
Have you?
Yeah. In a Pathfinder campaign, I was playing a blind character.
There
as
you
well.
go.
His blind one-armed duelist.
Yeah.
Yes.
He beat you.
Hey, that was a practice.
There's that personality coming out.
Yeah, there's a
But it's okay because we all know the test and we can all have an appreciation for it.
Funny.
Interesting.
And it's all these little things that give hints to the clues of what you might be. So creative players. Gaining sense of prestige through collection of things, even without in-game benefit, is one sort of a hint that could be you. Wanting to collect the whole set of stuff just for completion is another kind of trait in that space. Another thing a creative player may be interested in doing through their character creation process is I touched on this before, is creating a really rich character background to support the stats that they create for the game. They're the sort of people who will sit down, like GM Huzz tends to do, and I've watched him do annoys me because he's so quick at it. But when he does character creation, he sits down and types up this massive background for his character in the space of about 5 minutes, and then comes back to actually draft what the character is. So that's
Deep.
It is deep. It is deep. And the creative player has a relationship with the competitive player as well. We sort of bring that full circle.
Yep.
In the system orientations of games, where they can be the sort of person who can enjoy the character creation process because they like to min-max their results. So it's about being creative through that process of designing characters or collecting items or building skill levels or whatever, but doing it in a way that maximizes efficiency for them in the game. They can also enjoy gaining levels as well, equipment's advances and those sorts of things, but that's always focused on building functional ability. They can also be people who might enjoy games where they get to create what happens in the game as they go. So in a board game sense, playing games that have boards that you create as you play the game, or that are varied each time you play the game.
Yep.
An ideal example of that. In an RPG setting, it'd be where you can influence the world setting through the process and actions of what you choose to do as a player.
So that basically that means that there are 4 types. We've got competitive players, social players, immersive players, and creative players.
Yes.
So which category do each of us fit into? Well, I'm glad that you asked that question. As we mentioned earlier, before the show, we all took part in Mick's player personality quiz, for want of a better term, to give us our own percentages, which we shall now share with our listeners. Now, I'm going to go through each of our results individually and read out our percentages for each category. So we shall start with GM Huzz. See whether this suits you, because I know when I did it and took a look at my results, I was actually quite surprised.
I won.
As in all things.
You won the personality test?
Oh, no, I'm going to fail that. That's like a given.
Yeah.
So for GM
You
Huzz,
and me both, buddy.
You scored 0. No.
It's like, you don't even have a personality. What is wrong with you?
His personality's below the score.
Over
And
9,000.
you just have that like Fifth Element moment where he's like, I know.
wow. Whew. So for GM Huzz, or your highest percentage is creative.
Okay.
The next highest is social,
Okay.
then immersive, and then competitive at a fairly low 57%.
Yeah.
Would you concur with that?
Yeah, I think so. I like being creative. I like being social. I like being immersive. So it stacks up.
Yep, pretty good. So you were very close with your immersive and creative. Sorry, your...
See, with creative and immersive, creative and immersive, I almost, in some aspects, I see it personally, in some degrees, as both the same in some moments. So that's probably why it's quite close.
Yeah, well, actually, those 3, I mean, you had creative at 100%, social at 90%, and immersive at 87%. So, that's pretty all-rounder. And then, to drop right down to 57% for competitive, obviously, that's not the style of play that you like to do.
No, not for tabletop games.
No.
If that was Rainbow Six,
different story.
Destruction and mayhem everywhere.
Indeed. For Martin, you have 100% creative, then 93% immersive, 80% social, and 67% competitive. Mm-hmm. So an interesting sort of blend there. For Kaitlin, you were 100% competitive. No, I'm just kidding. You were 97% social. You're actually the most social out of all of us. So
that is so surprising, considering I don't consider myself very social, but I'm social with you guys. So that's probably
that
why.
is true. Yeah. So 97% in social, 93% in immersive, 87% creative, and 43% competitive.
There you go. That makes sense. That 43%.
So Michael, our guest for today, you've got an even 90% for immersive and social, 80% creative, and 43% competitive.
Sounds about right.
For me, however, I had an even 93% for immersive and social, 67% creative. That's what really surprised me about me. I learned something about me.
Well,
today.
I think from GMing, like being creative is a part of GMing, but I think the main principle of GMing is immersion and
Being social.
Yeah, because the way I see creativity is more you personalizing a specific tailored thing about you in role playing sense about your character.
Right.
At GM, you have to control everything, so you can't micromanage every single little creative element.
True.
It's a large part. Yep. But
it's creating that
more.
setting that everyone can immerse themselves in.
And then the last one for me was 30% competitive. And that doesn't surprise me at all because I can't stand competition. I just don't like it because maybe it's because I always lose in games and stuff like that. But and I just don't enjoy the competitive side of things at all. I much prefer to engage socially. That's so that doesn't surprise me at all. So, yeah.
What's interesting about all of that is that we scored all very low on the competitive side, and I think that that is part of the reason why we get along as a
Yeah, and I mean that is something that I think for new people it's important to do, but for people who have been gaming for a while together, get your players to do that with you, and you'd actually be surprised that you probably already fit that category, or your categories kind of match anyway, because that's just the sort of people that you've attracted to over time.
Yeah. That from a psychology standpoint, like attracts like. So we get along most with people who are more like us.
Yep.
That's what happens naturally. So that's not surprising at all. I also think too, from a gameplay standpoint, that role-playing probably lends itself to the three other archetypes that are not competitive in general.
I think that, going by that, I wasn't surprised to find out that I'm probably the most competitive of us.
Right.
But,
it's not a competition, Martin. Come on.
but I won.
I've won role-playing, but yeah, I mean, you are sitting against 67%, which is fairly high. But interestingly enough, you're fairly high with all of them, which means that, generally you could probably read something from that as well, is that you are really into gaming. If you've got high scores in everything, you've really loved your gaming side of things. Whereas someone who, if they've never ever gamed before, it might be a case of, well, those sorts of things really aren't really sort of important to me, and so all of their ratings may be low. It just depends.
I mean, I think one of the things, if someone's just walking into gaming for the first time, doing something like this would help them find their place and earn their, learn what they enjoy.
Sure.
Be able to enable that.
And on that point, one of the things to keep in mind is that the more experience you have and the more diversity of experience you have across gaming, different systems, different types of games, board games, card games, role-playing games, whatever, the more experience you have, the more you have to reflect on in terms of answering a little quiz like this. For new players, I would always recommend getting out there and experiencing lots of different types of games, lots of different board games, card games, role-playing games, different types of rules formats within those structures. Because the more experience you have across a range of different things, the more that you can reflect back on in terms of understanding what you like and what you don't like. So when you're answering the questions in this little quiz, for those people who are very, very new to gaming and maybe only played one system, they may find that difficult to work through the questions and answer them. You really do need some practical experience in this space to draw back on those personal likes and dislikes to make those questions meaningful. So if you find it hard, if you come as a new player and do the quiz and you think, I'm not really sure how to answer this, just put it aside for a little while and go out and play some games and have some fun and don't worry about it. Come back later on. But for experienced players, I do think it's worthwhile to sit back and reflect, do the quiz and reflect on it as a group, because there may be stuff about your experience as a group that sort of starts to go back, sort of goes in the unconscious where you don't think about it from time to time, and that's where you may find that one player's preference naturally is sort of dominating the table, and maybe that hasn't been working, and that could have been the cause of some stress or conflict for you.
Well, it's like this quiz could be, if a long-standing group does this quiz could be enlightening to them. Because okay, well, we didn't realise that Jimmy Smith is this type of player. And Jimmy Smith's like, I didn't realise that either. And all of a sudden, the other players can adapt to that, and Jimmy Smith can adapt to other players.
And they can enjoy the game more. So they were going, oh, right, I never realised that I was so competitive. So it's like, okay. So I need to, as a GM, you'd be going, okay, so I need to put a little bit more sort of, they may really enjoy that nemesis character that always seems to have that little bit better gear than they do. Like if you were to put into a speed racer type RPG, that you would say, right, well, I'm a competitive player, so the nemesis, who is also one of the speedsters on the circuit, just seems to always have that little bit better gear, and so that's a driving force, and so they're going to enjoy that. Their time in the game a little bit better. They're going to
enjoy overcoming that challenge.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you'll find that player then might focus his competitive nature not at the table amongst the other players / characters.
Yeah.
He may then suddenly focus his competitive streak towards an NPC the GM has deliberately put into the game to, I'm going to use the word, bait that character's competitive streak.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing because that's still good role-playing.
Yeah. And that's sort of feeding that desire, that need of your player, so that they're going to enjoy the experience more. Yeah, absolutely,
absolutely. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about how to work out what sort of players that you have at the table, what sort of player that you are. Are there any sort of other aspects that we can throw into the mix as well, to enable your game to be just that little bit better as far as the types of players that you have at the table?
Well, I mean, you did just mention one good example is, tailoring that experience to the players in order to focus their creative energies or their likes and dislikes on the game rather than on each other.
Yeah.
And that can help, give everyone something enjoyable from the game.
Because the competitive player, correct me if I'm wrong, competitive player is one of those ones that does like to create that chaos side of things.
Maybe. Certain flavours of the competitive
individual.
Yeah, certain flavours of the competitive player certainly can love to do that. So I can recall back an experience of running a game and one of the players who is highly competitive in his archetype would always fire into melee combat. Always. If there was a battle going on, he just didn't care that there was a chance he was going to hit one of the PCs.
Yeah.
And couldn't quite understand why people had a problem with that. It was like, well, the rule says I can, and there's a chance I can do that, but that's just a consequence of the game, right?
Yeah.
I go, no, that's your choice as a player. And, that's okay if everyone's accepting of those circumstances, but in making those decisions, that player wasn't recognising why they were doing it themselves and what impact that was having on other people. So that's the way that sort of comes in. The competitive player can be someone who is competitive in terms of their interaction with the world setting, and the mechanics of the game. So so in crafting the experience for everyone at the tabletop, ensuring that there's a good, healthy combat encounter might satisfy a competitive player.
Yep.
Or a tournament style encounter or something like that as well, where they have to actually go up through the ranks to win or
that's right.
Come out the victor.
Likewise, because they relate into the social space as well as a competitive player, it can be through social encounters, a competition of the social encounter of negotiating a really heady treaty. Instead of glossing over that exchange, you can actually turn it into a whole session of gaming, and that would float the boat of that kind of person ideally.
Absolutely.
And it sort of sounds like we're singling out this competitive player. Not at all. The competitive player is still can be a very good player at the table. You just need to recognise that they are the competitive player and adapt the story.
The easiest one to give an example for.
Exactly. But I think if we're doing the example in the competitive player, we should then also the example of the other two. How the GM and other players can work with those other two archetypes.
So just to remind everyone, these archetypes are in reference to how you as a player draw your enjoyment out of the game play. So these are the sorts of activities or the happenings that are occurring in the game that are going to make you most satisfied with the gameplay experience that you've had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like when we were talking about giving examples for the other areas, like an immersive one, and as the example you even mentioned before, a little bit more description about what was happening in the scene would be better for me. Like and then knowing that characters who like to be fully immersed in the story, GMs can just spend a little bit of extra time providing that extra level of detail. Maybe they describe how the candlelight flickers along the wall in order to create the shadows around the room or anything like that, just to make characters actually feel like they are there. You could talk about the smells that are in a room, or maybe when they walk into a town, you not only describe what the town looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, but you also describe the history of the town. Why was the town given its name? Who are some of the key factors? Who are the key people around that town? Sometimes characters who don't necessarily care about that level of detail would be happy to go, it's your standard, medieval town. You've got your blacksmith hammering away, and then you go in. What are you going to do? I go find the local tavern. Players can have just as much fun with that level of detail, whereas immersive characters might want that extra layer added on top of it.
An immersive character will be craving more sensory detail because they're going to use that information to picture those things in their head. The other thing the immersive player does, and I talk from my own experience, is that when they're describing all those things that you've just described, GM Kaitlin, in that narration of setting the scene, I'm also thinking about, say we're talking about the L5R playtest, and GM Hooly's put in a little bit of extra effort in recent sessions to describe things for me. What I'm doing while he's doing that is I'm thinking about movies like 47 Ronin and The Last Samurai and all the scenes that my mind is taken back to through that description, and that's filling in the depth of my imagination and my experience of the game setting as well. So that's how these sorts of temperaments or archetypes work for us, is that they connect with a deeper part of who we are, and that's what adds to our satisfaction of the game.
Yep. And there may also be some added side effects to this. If the GM starts to become more immersive, because he knows he has one or two immersive players at the table, he can then start to get more comfortable with that, then start introducing hints to the plot to the players for immersion. Yep. You walk through that fantasy town that Kaitlin was just describing. He also mentions the mood of the people is very glum. The players might go, why are these people so glum? What's got them so downtrodden? And then they go to start talking to players because of that one immersive detail that you would normally skip over in a very brief description of a fantasy town. Immediately the players around the table go, well, something's going on here. Their ruler or their lord must be particularly bad. Why is that happening? And we'll go talk, and that builds potentially a story the GM hasn't even planned.
Absolutely.
And the second thing as well about immersion, and people understanding there might be immersive players at the table, there's the benefit of doing this quiz. If I know I may not be a 100% immersion-based player, but I still enjoy it. But I know Jimmy Smith, he's getting around. Jimmy Smith loves immersion. So when the GM's adding that extra layer of immersion, I know as a player not to interrupt that moment of immersion with a quick question or comment or loud discussion to another player, because that is ruining that person or multiple people's immersion that the GM is especially putting into the scene. And that comes into what we talked about before, that it's sort of like a self-feeding cycle of the benefits of this quiz. Once you start to understand what people's archetypes are at the table from the GM seat and player seats.
I think one of the great things from a GM standpoint that you can use this framework as a tool to make sure that as you craft your story moving forward, that you actually hit each of these categories in the way in which you set scenes and the way in which you move your story forward. And regardless of who's sitting at the table, if you can, over the course of your adventure, hit each of those categories, then what you're doing is giving the most rounded experience for a player possible, because, as I said before, no one of these aspects is better than another, and we all have aspects of all of it within ourselves. So if you focus on some at the exclusion of others, you're not actually giving anyone at the table the full experience.
And I think as well what is interesting in terms of that conversation when we're talking about how we can make these games meet our players' drivers, is that it'd be interesting to do this survey and we were talking about this before, a different style of games. Like when you're on the computer, you're a different player than when you're around the role-playing table. But you could also look at this quiz from the perspective of being a player and then also actually being a GM. Because I know for me, when I'm being a GM, I like being immersive when I'm talking about the world that I've created. So I do give a lot more detail, and I do like going to that extra step as a GM. As a player, I love that as much as I love being social with my gaming, but I'm not as as you said. I was like, it's one of the second levels when it comes to where I get my enjoyment out of it. So you could even look at it from the different way as, okay, as a player, this is where I get my enjoyment, but as a GM, this is also where I get my enjoyment when I'm going around the table. And then your players can feed off your enjoyment and how you're enjoying the game, as well as designing it for the people that you have there.
Which is important because, the GM's enjoyment of the game is essential.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
And as a quick additional note, it's sort of this discussion sort of got me thinking about the archetypes and the benefits of knowing the archetypes. When you're a GM, you're setting up a campaign or an adventure or whatever. If you keep all three of these archetypes in mind and make sure you inject them equally into, four archetypes and inject them into your story, you realize each separate piece goes together for one larger, more beneficial piece. It's like it's like a Voltron of assembly of your thing, because you've got creativity, which you makes you inject interesting scenes and story, immersion, which makes you really, really amplify those creative scenes of immersion.
The details,
exactly. Yeah. Competitiveness could probably let you really start to establish strong story and quest lines, I guess, for your players that are more than the run the mill go kill 10 rats.
Challenge them.
The challenge, perfect.
It can drive them, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
And then everyone gets a social experience out of this.
That's right.
It enhances the social experience because everyone's now on this new level that the GM's brought in. And he's just used these as... Is tenants the right word in this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a guide.
Pillars of gaming.
Pillars? Yeah.
Yeah.
Pillars?
Because you can have social around the table, but also social for your characters. Your characters can... I know when we get around the table, as soon as Ian mentions an NPC, we go and create a whole entire backstory for an NPC that we only spent 2 minutes talking to. But we create a social encounter with them that we can even bring him back or, have an ongoing relationship with that character, because that's where we get our enjoyment from. Not only social around the table, but social with our characters.
That also includes the NPCs that you kill.
I know.
Yeah, we do that too.
To be fair,
there's a lot of widows out there.
I know.
and kids.
And kids.
Kids with no parents.
Yeah. We don't hold any punches.
No.
There's a lot of orphans too.
No.
Very
The
quickly,
women and the children.
Oh, no.
No one thinks of the children.
One of the things that, pro tip, we're talking about immersion, just want to go back to that very, very quickly, is that when you've got a scenario that where you have a player who is very much immersive, and this is something that Michael, you raised, it was between you and Harris that you mentioned it, who was another one of our players, is that you have 5 senses. So you always, and in some cases, if you've got a magic, you've got a 6th sense as well, that always use at least 3 of those to set that scene. And so, it could be the smell of the area, it's the look of the area, if there was a magic or force related, it's a certain vibe that you're feeling through the ebb and flow of the force, or that there's a tingling with the magic in the area, that sort of thing. You only need to do it, 3 times, or even 2, depending on what sort of players that you've got, to really set that scene to help with that immersion. And it's just that little bit more of an effort that can actually really help that immersive player to enjoy the game and feel a little bit more included. It's like, oh, cool. So now I can picture that scene better in my head. And probably the best way, and I think I mentioned this in the last episode as well, Genesis in particular teaches us to do that when we do a skill challenge or when we do some sort of skill check, because you're adding a boost die or a setback die, or you're setting the difficulty, or you're upgrading the check. You're using the environment, so you're using those senses to build that immersion into the check.
Yeah.
So don't forget
and also reading the check and interpreting it after you've rolled it.
And so look at that beyond the skills check, and look at that when you're talking about just creating the scene of when they go into a town, for the example that Kat used or whatever else?
Well, I had an exact example of this come up the other day. I was playing in a game and we're fighting some creatures. And there was a fight occurring on a flight of stairs. And the scene was described as these hellhounds appear coming up the stairs as you're going down them. And everyone else is like, I get that, the stairs, whatever. And there's no other real details there. And so before the combat started, I had to ask the GM, I said to him, okay, are these like a fire escape type of stairs? Do they crisscross? Do they just go down to a flat platform? And he goes, the GM hadn't really thought about it. And he said, oh, yeah, this is how it works. And he detailed it. And I said, great. And I said, the only reason I said to all the other players, I said, the only reason I asked for those details is so when I'm doing checks and have advantages, or even deciding what I want to do, I can really use that creativity and immersion that the GM has set up for me to play in as a bit of a sandbox.
Yeah.
So in that very scene, instead of just walking down the stairs and punching the hellhounds, I used a story point to elbow a glass cabinet that was near the stairs where a fire axe was, and use my free running talent to jump down the stairs and land behind the other hellhound and bait it away from going up the stairs.
Yep.
Now, if that creative scene wasn't there and established for me to play with, my options would be I walk down the stairs and maybe use a fire axe instead of being dynamic
and roll my attack.
Exactly, but I was able to be a lot more dynamic because the storyteller painted the picture for me.
And for some players, what you initially described and their response of, great, I advance and I roll my attack with this weapon, that is all they need.
That's fine.
Right? Because if they're a competitive player focused on the mechanical aspects of the game, that can satisfy them as a player. Having, as you said before, using the 4 player archetypes as some framework with which to kind of describe what's happening in your game through, or even planning what's going to happen in your game through, become little tools for you to make sure that you provide a good range of information that literally informs people on what they can do next.
And it can there's no reason why you can't satisfy both of those players at the table.
Absolutely. Yep, exactly. So a tip for new GMs particularly, drawing back in what GM Hooly talked about and what you were just talking about, GM Huzz, is things that I've literally done because I like little reminders to help me with doing things, is you can write the 5 senses and your 6th sense if you're going to use that within your game. And I would argue that in any game setting, whether it's magic or not, you can have a 6th sense because you can use that to add mystery to what's going on. It can be something just doesn't seem right. Yeah, the gut feeling, something just doesn't seem right here. And people are going, well, what is it? And you go, well, you just can't put your finger onto it. Nothing creates suspense for people, than that stuff.
It comes down to that mood thing I was suggesting before you walk into the town. There's a sense of oppressive mood in the town. You can't put your finger on it, but everyone seems to be down. And
that's right. Yeah. So those sorts of things, they work. They help to inform people as to what's going on, and you can create all sorts of layers of depth in your storytelling collectively for the group. Yep. What I've done in the past is just written out on a little bit of paper the 6 senses. And you just peg it to the top of your GM screen.
Yep.
You can do the same thing with the player archetypes. Just write the player archetypes down and peg them to the top of your GM screen, just in a little short list, or write it down on your scratch pad. And then as you're coming to describe things, because sometimes you'll have to deal with things sometimes you ought to be dealing with things on the fly pretty regularly in a role-playing game, they give you something to go back to. And as GM Hooly was saying before, you can say, okay, in this particular scene, what people see and maybe the smell is more important. So I'll just hit 2 of those things because it's a quick little interaction that I've got to do on the fly. If it's something that's more important, then I might hit 3 of those senses. And then I might throw in the 6th sense to add an air of mystery because it's really, really important. You can just use them as checklists, as ways of going back to. And then as you get good at that stuff, you don't need to refer to those things anymore to become part of your natural skills and capability as a GM.
Yep. And you can also use those as story elements as well. So if you're walking into this town and we've said that, people are fairly downtrodden, why is that happening? The place is fairly sort of run down as far as the way that the buildings look. But it may also be the stench that's in the air.
It's a foul stench.
That sort of, what is that? And in actual fact, it's because all of the sewers are filled with zombies.
Yeah.
So, you're foreshadowing that just by using a sense.
And it can reinforce, one sense can reinforce another.
And it's creating that continuity as well throughout the story.
You could also use the archetypes to have a look at what the next encounter that your players are going to use. Like if you're using the immersion, senses to determine what the scene is going to be like. Say you haven't had a social encounter lately. Maybe that would be the next thing that your characters could give a go at. We're talking about the four pillars of how games could be done. This could be a really good way of going, well, what's next? And it could be a really quick way of going, we haven't done that lately. That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and that adds variety to your game. The other thing that allows you to do is if you have quite a diverse group of people around the table, that gives you cues or opportunities to spotlight each player, to give them a scene where they can thrive and be the champion in that moment based on feeding what their primary archetype is.
Interesting.
Well, the listeners should be happy. They got a free little lesson about how to establish scenes.
Indeed. But I think all of that is really important for knowing your players and adapting to their needs to make the game more enjoyable for them. And in turn, if your players are happy, the GM's happy.
Yep.
And
if the GM's
vice
happy,
versa.
then the player's happy. So
Exactly.
it feeds on each other.
It does.
Yeah.
So
And it's, I think the thing for me is that the players in the game aren't separate pieces.
No.
They're intertwined, and just having that aspect in mind means that you are able to piece together this collage of varying factors into its most appropriate way.
Knowing the archetypes removes a massive hurdle. This could be very useful for a first-time, so I won't say first-time GM, but a GM running a game for a new group of veteran players. He's met these guys via, he's sent out a message online. He said, I want to run this Pathfinder game this Saturday. Everyone come and meet up or make characters. And he can do this survey then, and he can find out what his characters are going to be. And that immediately knocks down that sometimes and often awkward hurdle of A, getting to know who these people are on a fundamental social non-gaming level, and B, what they're like at the table.
Yeah.
This almost in one swoop answers both those questions.
Yeah.
And it gives that GM an immediate head start on a new campaign with new players. So it helps both types of GMs.
Michael, when you had the quiz and then hearing our results, was there anything that you thought was interesting after creating this quiz and then, hearing us and playing with some of the players in this podcast? Is there anything that you thought was interesting in the results that we had or some of the responses that we provided?
Yeah, was there anything that surprised you?
In terms of your results, in my experience of you, nothing hugely surprising.
He was like, no, because I'm a very good psychologist.
I wouldn't be here if I didn't know the outcome already.
The most interesting fact of that is that I'm actually not a qualified psychologist. I more just dabble in it.
Yep.
I like to dabble in people's brains. It gives me much entertainment.
Right. I want to play in that setting. Anyway, moving on.
So in terms of whether there was anything surprising for me in that, not hugely. I think that in terms of my personal experience of people at the table, unfortunately, I don't have the benefit of that for you, GM Kaitlin. Nothing too surprising in there. It didn't raise any eyebrows for me in terms of people being lower in the competitive aspect of play. I would suggest probably role-playing tends to lend itself to that anyway. However, when you're looking at the other side of things across your social and your immersive and your creative players, what did you balance out on, GM Hooly? You had
with creative, and this is a thing that sort of surprised me. I was 67%, which was my third lowest as creative, which sort of threw me a little bit. So
see, I thought you would have rated a little bit higher in creative. That if I was to have a guess at it, I thought immersive and creative and social and competitive view is how I would have pegged that. But in talking about that amongst ourselves a little bit more, I can see how those questions have come out for you, and there can be, and as we said before, these things interrelate to each other. There are sort of neighbours to each archetype has a neighbour that relates as well. And what people typically find is that if you lay out the four archetypes in a quadrant layout, like in a cross sort of a layout, you'll find that you have three that sort of join in together and one that stands out on its own in the opposite corner. And that's the case for all of us with the fact that competitive
is down so
low, but when we rate highly in the other three, which are neighboured, it depends on where you sit in that. So yeah, no, not any huge surprises for me in that sense. I guess the thing, and we've talked a bit about percentages, and we've done that as a way of creating some nuances or detail in how we talk about it. We'll make the quiz available for people to have a bit of a play with and explore for themselves, and you won't get percentages out of it. You'll just get a result that says your answers indicate that you are a social player, and depending on the format, we can get that up. Hopefully, we'll give you a secondary archetype as well.
Yep.
So what it's really to do is just to sort of say that here's your primary preference, and hopefully we can also indicate a secondary preference for you. And we'll also give descriptions of what those player archetypes are, and just through reading those things, you'll get some insight into yourself and other players that you normally spend a lot of time with.
Yeah. A quick, you being the expert of this, Mick, would you say this stuff is locked in stone? I do this quiz and I go, okay, I rate higher and competitive than I thought I was. That's odd. Could you as a player then at the table try and self-moderate yourself? Or in Ian's case, you thought you would be more creative. So maybe you could use that as a guide to say, well, okay, maybe I want to try and deliberately force myself to be more creative. I don't know how you'd do that, because if that's not inherently what you are, then that's not what you are. But maybe you could use this is a bit of a gauge to see where you wanted to bump or increase your stats, I guess you could call it.
So looking at it from a self-reflection perspective, I guess, is that I look at that and look at where everybody else sits as far as their creative aspect. And if I can see that my creative aspect is lower than everybody else's, that means that there may be some things in my games that aren't necessarily being met to the extent of what the other players want, which may, talking about what we did before, about what the situation with you, Michael, was, that where I wasn't giving enough of a description. So maybe I wasn't being not necessarily immersive, but I wasn't being as creative about...
Creative with your immersion.
Yeah. So because of that means that, I can see, okay, as a GM, I need to meet the needs of all of my players, so I need to increase that a little bit more.
But funnily enough, me, Martin, myself, and Kaitlin, immersion wasn't our top one. None of our top ones.
No.
So you've been role-playing, DMing for us for a long time. And immersion, like hardcore immersion, isn't one of our top priorities. So you've probably molded yourself as a GM to meet our needs. So when someone like Mick comes along who has a very high immersion rating, your GMing style doesn't quite synchronize 100%. Because you don't have that at the table with us as such. Like you look at in our junkyard, we have Sean and... Cam and Bill, I don't think any of them would rate immersion as the highest, but they'd probably rate social and creativity as their top ones. I would imagine all of them would be low on competitiveness. But I don't think any of us are overly prioritizing immersion as much as Mick does, and so you've just become a GM who's adapted your style to that. It's an interesting sort of way to look at it.
Look further to that. I don't surround myself with people who, as far as players, that are competitive. But looking at that, I know that Martin's is fairly high. So that to me says that, okay, well, I might need to adapt a little bit more at the table to satisfy that need. So, if we're looking at it, how can a GM or a player use that to make their games better, which is ultimately what the purpose of this episode is about.
That's it.
Is to look at those and use them as a tool to better equip yourself with the knowledge of how to run your games just that little bit better to meet the needs of everybody at the table.
And it's important to also say, while we're saying all this, you shouldn't feel like you have to force yourself to change.
No, not at all.
However, if you think you might be able to improve certain aspects, go for it. And if you find yourself just feeling uncomfortable in the long term, well, this is not for me. I'm going to go back to how I feel more comfortable playing or GMing.
And that comes back to the point I made before, is that you may have a certain theme or style or game that you want to play, and that may not suit certain player archetypes. And that's okay. So there's nothing wrong with you playing the thing that you really want to do It's just that everyone who participates in that, and you as a GM, if you're inviting people to participate, you can then make an informed decision about the suitability of that, knowing that everyone will have a differing level of experience and enjoyment in being involved. So relating that back to myself, I had no issue with the experience of the game that we were playing. It was immensely fun, and I was totally enjoying it. It's just the question was asked, how could I make it better for you?
Well,
and I said, well, by doing these things.
Exactly right. If I was playing, even though creativity is my top score, if I was playing in an immersion heavy GM, I'm not going to sit there going, oh, I'm sick of all this immersion.
You might not
I don't care how I feel in this scene. I don't care what anyone else smells like. Just tell me what I'm supposed to do.
What should I kill?
I'm going to kill everyone unless we stop doing this immersion. And that's
What
me getting mad at-
creatively stare?
Yes, creative murder. Yes.
I'm going to do a lot of flips.
But ultimately, it's about fine tuning.
That's a good word to say.
If you've been playing in a successful game, and I think that if you're a GM or a player and you aren't looking for ways to be better at what you're doing, that you're always learning.
You never
there's
stop
always
learning.
No, that's right.
No.
And if you've basically just gone, well, I can't learn any more about gaming.
Oh.
Firstly, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast.
I
think-
it's stuck on the station. They can't change.
I want to make one comment there before we sort of wrap up this bit.
Sure.
We've recently discovered that we knew nothing about Edge of the Ember in terms to some rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've been playing this game for so long that when we've come across these things, it's made us look and reflect upon how we can now incorporate that and going forward. It's like you never stop learning. There are always new things to learn and new ways to adjust and grow as a player and as a GM.
It's all about willing to accept that you can do that.
Yeah.
And to relate that back to what the question that GM Huzz asked before is that about whether this changes over time. Simple answer is yes.
Excellent.
Because it is talking to, if we're talking about a psychology standpoint, it's talking to temperament. So from a developmental theory standpoint, we change as we grow older, and that continues through our 40s and 50s and so on. We do, because we do keep learning all the time.
I just keep getting more and more bitter.
But like a fine coffee roast.
Yeah, with chocolate overtones. So it does change over time. So for listeners who are quite young, for example, you may see, if you're in your late teens or early 20s, if you came back and did this in 10 years' time, you might see a very different result. For new players who haven't had that breadth of experience, again, you may see a different result over time with more experience in gameplay. That can happen because we're also shaped by the environment that we're in. So if you've been introduced into a game, you may think that you have to play a game a certain way. You might not be actually consciously having those thoughts, I have to play this game this particular way, but you get socialized into playing games in a certain way. That may not actually be your natural temperament.
Yeah.
So, with experience and with maturity and with playing with different people, all those different things go into the mix to give you that perspective to reflect on, and that's where I think the growth comes from. So, yes, it can change over time. At some point, it will tend to settle into something, and you may flex a little bit in that space either way, and you certainly can become more adaptable.
Because that kind of happened to you as well when you first started getting into gaming in the first place, yeah?
Definitely. Well, in terms of like social interactions with characters, I started off being, I'm going to be a fighter character because I figured that would be the easiest to kind of play to learn the rules, because what do? You go in and you smash things. You don't have to worry about talking. But then the game that I joined in with you, I did, in the first time that we ever played together, I played Vixto in our Star Wars game, and she was very much a face character. And I still to this day have such an attachment to that character because she embodied everything that I love about gaming, which is the social, which is the immersion, which is the creative side of Star Wars and the world that I love in Star Wars, and how she was able to, be more social and be all the things that I kind of wish that I was, out away from the table, and I got to play as her and have that, and it was where I first discovered like how social and how much I loved story and how much I loved being immersed in that. And that completely changed from when I very first started playing around the table, and leads into what you guys were talking about before, which is trying all the different kinds of ways to game so that like before I sat around the table, I played a lot of video games, and I was always drawn to role-playing video games for the story, for the creativity, for some of those social aspects of the game. Not always did I pick up a game that was like Call of Duty or any of those games you had to play online in PvP type matches, because that wasn't my appeal. But, I tried all those different games that I knew. So you grow over time, and once you experience those different games and experience what you find enjoyable or even what you might find challenging that you get a kick out of, because we all know we play games because we like to achieve things, even if it isn't in a fictitious world, where you find you meet those achievements. For me, it was being social and being able to get out of my comfort zone and do something a little bit different. And from there, it's just kind of built and grown and completely changed. And as I said, I changed from being a player to being a GM. How I GM is different to how I get enjoyment from being a player. It's completely fluid in terms of how I go about and where I'm at in life.
The last thing we should mention is that no one play style is better than the others.
No. Absolutely right. And
I don't know. I think mine's better.
A competitive player would disagree.
But yeah, so ultimately every play style, like everybody's individual and everybody enjoys games for different reasons. And yeah, no one play style is better than the other.
And we have all of them within us.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And they will be brought out to the fore depending on the circumstance we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And, at the end of the day, the whole purpose of this is really just to bring some of these concepts out into the forefront of people's awareness so that they can just think about it a little bit and maybe influence some of the decisions they make.
And the biggest thing, this quiz should not be used for evil.
No,
Never.
that
With
is
great
true.
power comes great responsibility.
Don't say, right, well, sorry, you're too competitive, so you're out of my game. That is not the intent behind doing this. It's to give you more tools in your GM toolbox
Yeah.
Awesome.
And
Yeah.
look,
to play with.
and I would hope that if you have got a conflict at the table, in that sense, that if this provides you an insight to understand why that conflict's happening,
And to have that conversation.
then you can have that conversation about, are you two, or you three aware of the dynamic of what maybe, what could be going on here? Do you notice the differences between you as players? And sometimes that's enough for people to go, oh, yeah, wow.
And if they can't resolve it at the table in a nice grown-up fashion, they can always have a cage fight above lava.
Always a good
Exactly.
option, in my opinion.
Exactly.
Particularly the lava, I think, is the most important element of that. Without it, you're just fighting in a cage. and
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
no fun.
I don't want to attend a boring
We
cage
all used
fight.
to doing that. That's everyone's Saturday. Add lava, then you've got an interesting scenario.
Wait on. How about lava with lava sharks?
Lava sharks are my favorite animal. How did you know?
Wow. I much prefer ill-tempered sea bass, but,
Ill-tempered lava sharks.
there you go. I'll live with that.
And everyone is satisfied.
I'm not satisfied because I like tentacles.
That's, no. Let's,
And with that note, I think there's some place we'd rather be. Is that, what do we call that?
I think I'd prefer to be right now behind the screens.
Hey, Mick, give us a call.
Behind the Screens. And welcome to Behind the Screens, where we, the hosts of the show, will answer your games and rules questions regarding the Genesis role-playing game. And again, of course, in gaming in general. So tonight, though, we have just the one question. So, Mike, would you like to run us through that question?
Our question comes from Jeffrey Jones. He asked us on Facebook with a few other questions, but we picked this one because we thought, hey, this is perfect because we do have a guest here who has just recently created his own setting for Genesis. What Jeffrey asks is, what about bringing people on who have done conversions and go through the logic choices they've made as well as the pitfalls they encountered?
And that's obviously a long, long conversation. But since Mick's
Well,
here...
I have time. Let's get the cup of tea going.
Let's-
And
So when you were in that sort of mindset for designing Dread, what were some of the pitfalls that you came across?
Interestingly, And I say interestingly because in asking that question, it just made me realise some of the process that I went through in doing that, which I hadn't actually stopped to think about before, because my experience of doing the stuff for Dread was I read the Genesis rulebook, and as I was reading through it, I'm going, wow, this is an amazing system. Like, it's so fluid and so adaptable. It can do all these different sorts of things. And straight away I was like, well, I need to this has to be used somehow for me to really fully appreciate it as a system. And I knew that by doing that, I'd also help me to learn the mechanics of the system as well by doing something in practice.
I was blown away by how quickly you turned that around. You're like, 1 week, I bought the Genesis rulebook. Cool. I've made a Dread setting. All right.
Wow. Yeah. Is now a good time to mention how I'm an immersive player? So when I sort of, have these experiences, I tend to get immersed in what's going on. And from a personal standpoint, what's happening internally for me is there is a million ideas going through my head and a million pictures playing in my imagination, and there's all these things going on, and I have to get them out. And so that's part of that process of feeding that temperament that's within myself. So what I didn't realise that I had done is that in reading the rules and getting excited about it, I already had a seed that I wanted to pick up some running a game again for myself. And initially I was thinking I'll just do something nice and simple. So I'll go back to the old Games Workshop's Judge Dredd role-playing game, because it's a very, very simple mechanic. And having a love of the comics, I can make a lot of that up on the fly, basically. And then reading through Genesis, I thought, actually, I could very easily adapt that into this, and it would actually be a much more fulfilling game because of the way the character mechanics differed. What I didn't realise I'd done until just now is that the first thing that I did in making that setting, for me, and this comes back because it's my temperament, is that I thought about the setting first. I thought about the world, what it was like, and I started to think about the experience that I wanted players to have in that world setting. So I started thinking themes and tropes and storylines and plots and those sorts of things. And because it's such an unusual world setting in itself, that mood and that feeling was really, really important. So what I then started to do is come up in my head. It was just a mental list of different sorts of things that I wanted to impart to players as an experience through that game. And then I took that stuff and put it back to the rules mechanics and started to look at how can the rules deliver on the experience that I want them to have. So at the highest level, that's what was going on for me. There was some pitfalls that I found because depending on what you want to do in the world setting, there may be things that you want to have occur that don't actually work within the rule structure. So in one instance in particular, I made a decision that I would break the rules for the purposes of introducing an element into the game.
And that was your...
the challenge.
The challenge system.
Yeah. So something that runs through the comic book like mythos of the Judge Dredd universe is this context of the challenge. Despite the hard, gritty thing of the future where bullets are flying and, people are fairly expendable, it's a bit of a misconception, that a judge is not whilst they can be a judge, jury, and executioner, their primary role is to keep law and order and bring people to justice. So wherever possible, they're not really meant to execute people on the street willy-nilly. So throughout the comics, you see this exchange between judges and citizens of them using their positions of authority to call people to surrender. So there's always these challenges of wrong, like evildoers out in the world and criminals and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And in the role-playing games that I've experienced in that space, in that Games Workshop version, and then also in Mongoose Publishing's D20 version of the Judge Dredd role-playing game, they have or maintain that system of the challenge within there that you can call a perp to surrender within the game. So the first thing for me, and as a stumbling block, is that I looked through the social encounter rules of Genesis and went, oh my God, this is amazing. You can actually make a social attack on people, targeting their strain threshold in this system. That's so much cooler than the examples that I've seen in previous game mechanics for this. Amazing. That's great. I can do that. So awesome. I'll just run those rules, except that you can't really use those rules as written in combat encounters, which is where predominantly you would be using them because they're meant to be used in narrative social encounters.
Yeah. Unless you put the stop to the combat encounter, change it to a social encounter, that'll proceed for several turns, then change back to the combat encounter if it fails, which is which can be jarring to the gameplay experience for everyone at the table, especially those who aren't involved in social combat.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the problem that I had in implementing that mechanic that I wanted to continue through previous editions of the game was that when that's applied, the circumstances can be varied. So you might be turning up at the time when a crime's about to be committed, and the judge can issue a challenge then. And in reality, that's a social encounter. You're not in combat. It may or may not move to that, potentially, depending on what happens. Yep. But likewise, there could be, I don't know, a gang war going on, and you turn up and the shots are already firing. Yeah. So that's a combat encounter. But in that circumstance, you still want them to be able to interject a challenge at that point in time, because the idea is that in the world setting, before lethal force is used, you must first give the perp an opportunity to surrender, unless it's considered, inappropriate or pointless in the circumstances. So there's a fluidity that's required in terms of how that might work. So I wanted, wherever possible, in creating my setting, what I found, or creating rules for the setting that I wanted to use, what I found, what I decided to use for myself, because I thought it was easier, was to always use existing rules wherever possible.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah. And adapt where possible.
And then adapt
where you need to.
Yeah, then adapt existing rules where I needed to. So in this circumstance around the challenge, for example, I decided that I would just keep the social encounter rules as suggested in the book, and they are listed as a suggestion. They essentially say, you can resolve social encounters in a range of different ways, and here's a few examples of how you might do that. And I went, I like that example. That's good. I'll run with that one. And then I needed to break the rules in terms of how those existing rule sets would be used within that setting. So in that circumstance, I just allowed people as an action in the game to issue a challenge to people, and then it would resolve like a social aspect of things, and it would be an action that would be permitted to be used in a combat encounter as well as social encounters. And then to not allow that to become something that could get out of control, where you just issue a challenge every turn because your social skills are so good that they're more powerful than the weapon damage you can deliver. I just limited that to one attempt per group in play.
And that reinforces the setting because, you issue a challenge, they're not going to surrender. Let's move on.
Let's go from there, yeah. And, and then through play testing, what I decided to do is to refine that slightly further to say that there would be circumstances where a second challenge might be appropriate.
Yep.
So, for instance, you might be in a gunfight, baddie rolls up despair, finds his gun empty. So instead of continuing the gunfight, you might close the distance, point your lawgiver in his face and say, "You're ready to give up now." That can be a chance where, if the GM allows, in that circumstance, you can allow a second attempt for the challenge. And in some circumstances might be appropriate for the expenditure of story point. Those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a fine line to walk, I find, personally, the social thing, is because you want the social stuff to be effective. At the same time, you don't want it to be more effective than shooting people. So if you're in a situation where Judge Dredd's a perfect scenario for it, if people just then resort to throwing challenges out instead of throwing bullets where necessary, the game becomes not what it's supposed to be very quickly. So it is a fine line you got to walk to find the perfect harmony of what works and what doesn't work.
In the Judge Dredd setting, the concept of the judge as their persona is meant to be this deliberately crafted position of authority within the world. So you do need to have an element of that social interaction to hold weight and have consequence in there, that it's meaningful and scary for the piece, the NPCs that are out there and all the perps. But you also don't want it to be a circumstance where the judges turn up and things have all gone, really bad, and one of the judges says, "I'll call for backup," and the other one goes, "Yeah, and I'll throw pronouns."
It's an ammo type in the lawgiver.
Yeah, that's right.
Pronouns.
So, you do need to create that balance. And for me, again, going back to what I was talking about, and this is the interesting thing about, we were talking about the player archetypes before, like I've learned something about myself in what I've done in this creating this world setting, is how I've naturally gone to that immersive style of saying, well, how do I give that experience that I want people to have here? So all that stuff about, what a judge is in this world setting and how people are meant to be responding to them and reacting to them and what perps are like, all those things are all the flavour of the world. And what I'm trying to do is figure out how do I use the existing rules as they are to deliver that experience to people as a player, and where it won't do that neatly, how do I tweak them firstly,
So that it does.
Yeah. Without having, because my view was, as soon as you create a whole new set of rules within that circumstance, it has the potential, this cascading effect throughout the rest of the rules at unbalancing other things or making other things not worthwhile. So, for example, Scathing Tirade as a talent within the world setting allows you in a combat environment to let loose with your Scathing Tirade and do damage to people. Now, granted, if you read that talent carefully, it does have another rules dynamic to it. As written, you can target more than one NPC within range. You can then also use your advantages to do additional damage, which you wouldn't normally be allowed to do in a social encounter.
Yep.
So by crafting the rules around the challenge in the way that I did, I kept it in the gambit and the parameters of a social encounter, but allowed it to be done in combat, and it still makes that Scathing Tirade talent worthwhile.
Exactly.
And it still adds another layer that someone can use in a judge who already embodies that position of authority, where they can throw the Scathing Tirade out as well as the challenge earlier on in the engagement.
So you could totally make a judge who specialises in
Pronouns.
Pronouns. Yeah. Exactly. But
From pronoun division.
if I was playing that judge character, and I was in a scene where I challenged someone and they refused to yield and they kept on being, lawbreakers, I would keep on shooting them whilst telling them they're all lawbreakers. And if they proceed in doing this, it's going to get worse. And keep laying down more sentences and with Scathing Tirade, and start just crippling the entire enemy you're fighting, knowing that they're completely up against the wall here. If they don't, the options are either to be shot by my lawgiver or to surrender, and just slowly wearing them down. But as you say, you don't want to become a game of pronouns. Exactly. That's the tricky part, because if you do that, it sort of eliminates the theme of Judge Dredd.
Yeah.
But if you take it away completely, it also eliminates the theme of Judge Dredd.
Yeah. and I maintain creative license in that rule set as well, in that as my guide of the challenge in there, it has the caveat that in some circumstances, some perps just won't surrender because they're that crazed or that desperate, or their face, that they just will not surrender no matter how many times you challenge them. You just can't do that damage to them. Your attempts to challenge them has no effect. And that's there because the idea is, what it basically allows is for a judge can literally walk into a room with a whole heap of lower level perps at play, and just by virtue of their mere presence turn them all into quivering piles on the ground.
There's a perfect example from the comics. Dredd tries to talk down Call Me Kenneth.
Yeah. And
Call Me Kenneth is just a robot who just wants to kill humans. There's no amount of words you can say to Call Me Kenneth that can turn him. There are no challenge will ever work because he doesn't care. He has no tie to what's being said. So why would he ever suffer any strain or effects from that? Because he's a murderous robot.
Exactly.
That needs to be a talent.
Immune to
being a murderous robot.
I was thinking murderous robot.
Yeah,
I'm
me
like,
too.
yes, I agree.
They're one of the same, so it all works.
So yeah, look, all that discussion we just had then, is really about, for me, in creating the world setting, I always come back to, what is the world setting about? What is it that you're trying to deliver on in terms of the story for that world setting? What's the mood, the feel? And the good thing about Genesis is it's got all that stuff about theme and trope and setting and, all discussed in the back of the book. Yep. Go back through and read through all of those sorts of things and start to think about which one of those would be applicable for you and what you want to do. Then come back and worry about the rules. I think that's the easiest approach, because at the highest level, thinking about what experience you're trying to deliver on points you in the direction you need to move initially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Start at the top, big brushstrokes, big concepts, and then start working down into the detail of things.
And refine it as you go.
You're not going to get it right the first time. And
play with it.
Yeah, play with it. And for me, I found that really refreshing, because my role-playing background came from games like Rollmaster. Where there was a rule for everything. There was a modifier chart for everything.
There is,
yeah, right. And at the time when I was doing that, I loved that. Like, it was amazing. But it's a lot of information to digest as well.
Yeah.
So, as I've said, whatever floats your boat, it doesn't really matter what you choose to do and play. For me now, because as we talked about before, my experience of these things has changed over time. And now it's so refreshing for me to look at to create a setting like Dread and go, okay, broad brushstrokes, bang, bang, bang. These are the things that I need to get the game going, and I'll refine it as I go. I've had the added benefit of being able to test this out with most of you here, knowing that you will happily do that and not care if it's not right. But more so, you're welcome. You are excited about the prospect of being able to input into it and help evolve it as well. And that's the benefit of knowing your players.
Yep.
In that setting as well. So, I think a lot of those discussions can be had in your session 0 up front. Is I'm going to do this setting. I'm not going to. Like some people want to sit down and write. Was it 666 pages of Shadowrun lore and rules for their setting? And if as I said, if that's what works for you, by all means do it. I just wanted the wheels on the wagon so I could start pushing it down the road, basically, with Dread. And I'm just going to make the rest of the stuff up as I go.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is technical things like vehicles and NPCs and robots and weapons and stuff.
That's what we've done with Night's Edge as well, is that we've started with that high-level approach in the setting roulette, where we've just come up with these general ideas of how the world will work, and then we've sort of gone further down the track to get into the nitty-gritty of the rules, and then obviously once we've created that base, then we've gone and done the live play, where we've learnt some things from that to go, right, well, we're not going to actually include that from the rules because that doesn't work for us. And we've been able to tweak the magic rules a little bit better so that we've got a much clearer idea. And this is where a lot of people I think, get things wrong when you're talking about fan-generated content, is that they just go, right, well, this is it, and it's never going to change. FFG has playtests. They design stuff, they put it out to a group of players, several groups of players when they do their playtesting, to make sure that it's right. And I tell you what, they don't always get it right either. And I know that we don't get it right. So, it is a case that all that sort of stuff can change during the game, and you have to make your players aware of that to make sure that, you're not sort of setting in stone and this is the only way that it can be.
Yeah, and I think GM Chris in the last episode hit the nail on the head. It's err on the side of caution. It's much easier to give your players something than it is to take it away.
Agreed.
And I think the other thing too, tips for people who want to get into this space and construct their own setting, whether it is making their own setting from scratch, or whether it is borrowing a setting that they love, is what you picture in your head and what you create for yourself will often not seem right enough. Like, it won't be good enough. What you imagine in your head, you often feel that you never can quite translate it, out onto paper in the way in which you wanted to.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that the way other people experience what you've created is not the same.
No.
So it's like an author can write a book and go, oh yeah, it was okay. I wasn't, really happy with that as a piece of work. But people who read it go, man, that was awesome. It was one of the best books I've ever written. And they're like, really? So just be kind to yourself. Like, give it a go. Have a crack at it. Put as much effort into it as you want. Approach it in whatever way works for you, and allow people to experience it and give that feedback. Especially if you set up that you want some of that feedback too. That's the way you can evolve it and build it. And also, doing it in that way takes the pressure off you as a GM to have to invent everything.
True. Very true. Very good. Well, I think that certainly answers that question. So hopefully, Jeffrey, that you've got a little bit out of that. And I know that we're pretty keen to do, another episode or several more questions when we bring guests onto the show to talk about their experiences in designing settings, which seems to be, exactly what Genesis is about, is allowing people to design their own settings from scratch.
Yep.
Hopefully, FFG will continue to give us the tools to do that with further setting expansions and things like that. But that brings us to the end of another show. So if you have any questions like the ones that Jeffrey asked, who has asked that on Facebook, you can send us an email to info@thedicepodcast.com. Or you can post your questions, as I just said, to Facebook or Twitter.
And don't forget, you can also find us on the Google machine if you look up the dicepoolpodcast.com.
And make sure to like and follow the Dicepool Podcast on Facebook and Twitter by searching at Dicepool Podcast. We also have our community group that you can share your ideas and activities, which is always great fun for us to see and perhaps mention on the show.
You can also find us on YouTube by searching at Dicepool Podcast. So if that is how you like to consume your podcast, check us out there. Or hey, even just head over there and give us a like. That would be amazing for us to give us an idea if that is something you want to see more of in the future.
Indeed. And of course, the last thing is you can also drop us a message on Discord as well, which you can find by going to the D20 Radio Network channel. And we have our own little hashtag there for the Dicepool Podcast. So go and check that out and drop us a message there as well, and we'll get back to you. But yeah, good episode, guys. I think that was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I hope it was useful.
It's definitely one of my favourites.
Yeah. And look, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to shoot them through those channels, and I'm happy to respond personally.
Absolutely. And we'll see if we can make the quiz available on the website as well, once so that you can go and take a look at that. Yeah. And hey, look, we'll put up a discussion. Let us know what your styles are. And, let us also know if you've learned anything a little bit about you or your players. Have a bit of a discussion about that. I think that would be quite interesting to hear about, to see how other players and GMs are using the skills that we've provided on the show. Then Michael's been kind enough to come in and discuss. So it'll be interesting to hear. So, Michael, thank you very much for coming on as our first live guest.
Oh, really?
They're usually dead.
Oh.
Necromancy is our forte.
GM Chris.
I feel especially privileged.
Yes.
You're welcome. Yeah, happy to. I hope people.
I think you mean in person.
Yes, in person. That's what I mean. Yes, that's what I meant.
That is what we meant.
Exactly.
Living in person.
You can't see, but I am winking.
With both eyes.
Starting to understand why you moved overseas.
Oh, I didn't move.
Have you not heard the shuffling in the ceiling?
So yeah, that's a wrap, guys. Thank you again, Mick, for taking the time to share your experiences with us and covering this very, very interesting topic. And thank you to the listeners for supporting us. It's always a pleasure to make this podcast possible with my co-hosts. So as normal, I'm GM Hooly.
I am GM Huzz.
I'm GM Flano.
And I'm GM Kaitlin.
And together we are the Dicepool Podcast, where adventure is just a roll away. The Dicepool Podcast is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Dicepool Podcast is a fan-generated podcast. All of the information provided on the podcast and related website are not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensed swords. The content of this podcast remains a property of the Dicepool Podcast and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesis role-playing game, the Genesis logo, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games.